Welcome to the Fantasy Audiobook. Marvel. Start with summoning the Shadow Troopers. Chapter 61. But even so, Richard didn't have any thoughts of letting this go. The purpose of Victor's existence, in Richard's view, is to find Dr. Doom for himself. If he can't be found, then there is no need for Victor to live. If he dies, he will die. So looking at Victor, who had begun to roll his eyes, Richard not only did not stop, but instantly strengthened his momentum. Puff! With the sudden increase in momentum, Victor rolled his eyes instantly, and his body was twitching constantly. And at this time, Richard suddenly felt the special aura on Victor suddenly intensified a lot. At the same time, Victor, who was almost suffocated by Richard's momentum, suddenly stopped struggling at this time, his face quickly calmed down, and his eyes slowly opened. Although Victor's appearance was exactly the same as before, the moment he opened his eyes, his temperament suddenly changed. Richard met his gaze, and the whole person was instantly refreshed. At this moment, Victor's eyes seemed to contain a universe, so deep and vast that people couldn't help but want to go deep into it. At a critical moment, a cool feeling suddenly appeared in Richard's mind, which instantly made Richard break free from Victor's eyes. But it was the sheep charm that played a role at a critical moment. A breath of foul breath came out of Richard's mouth slowly, and he knew that the righteous master he was looking for was coming. Moreover, his strength is even more terrifying than Richard imagined, and his mastery of magic has definitely reached a terrifying level, which instantly made Richard feel a little pressure. Forced to stabilize his emotions, Richard slowly put away the evil smile on his face. This method can only scare ordinary people like Victor. In the face of Dr. Doom, if he uses this method again, Richard seems to be a little petty. "It's you who put my clone in danger." The arrogant, indifferent voice slowly sounded, and Dr. Doom looked at Richard with a cold look. At this moment, he was like looking at a corpse, without showing any pity because of Richard's age. Of course Richard didn't need his pity. Not only that, in the face of Dr. Doom, a character who knew that he was not easy to mess with at first sight, Richard not only did not retreat, but took a step forward and admitted directly. "Yes, it's me." After saying this, the icy look in Dr. Doom's eyes was even more intense, but he didn't make any moves. Looking at this scene, Richard's eyes suddenly flashed a ray of light, and he continued to provocatively say, "CGDA, if you didn't show up just now, I would kill him directly. Don't you want to do something for him now? Or is there nothing you can do now? Let me guess, it's because your main body is trapped somewhere, and you can only drive your clone, but you can't use power, am I right?" Richard probed word by word, and the whole person felt tired for a while. There are too many superheroes in Marvel. If you encounter unfamiliar ones, you can only understand a little bit. Moreover, Dr. Doom is systematically rated as a 2-star character, and if you think about it with your butt, you will know that he is definitely a dangerous person. Therefore, when dealing with such a character, you have to be more cautious. And just after Richard finished speaking, Dr. Doom, who had been expressionless all along, showed a touch of emotion on his face and spoke again. "I don't know who you are, but I feel the dark power in you. Could it be that you came out of hell?" Hearing this, Richard instantly captured the key term, hell. Why did Dr. Doom suddenly mention hell, combined with the moving look on his face when Richard guessed that they might be trapped somewhere? Could it be that his body is currently trapped in hell? Thinking of this, the thoughts in Richard's mind suddenly turned quickly. Is there a god in the Marvel Universe? For this, Richard is not sure, but if he remembers correctly, a certain Marvel movie in the last life did tell about the existence of hell. The movie is called Ghost Rider. And now Dr. Doom is asking if he came from hell, which means that this is Marvel on one side. With this thought, Richard's head grew bigger, and at this moment he suddenly felt that the world seemed to be becoming more and more complicated. However, he did not continue to think about it. No matter what, it is the real business to get the Doctor of Destruction in front of him. Since Dr. Doom thinks that he came from hell, Richard doesn't mind taking the plan and making up another identity for himself. At the moment, Richard mobilized the darkness of the Shadow Core and applied it all to him, causing Dr. Doom's eyes to freeze. At the same time, Richard activated the power of the Dragon Talisman, causing him to exude the majesty of a dragon, and a dragon-shaped mask that vaguely appeared on his face. "I didn't expect you to see through my origins. If I expected it, well, you should be in God right now." Richard opened his mouth, and said in an old-fashioned tone, plus the faint dragon's might emanating from him at the moment, and the dark temperament brought by the black shadow core, now he really looks like a man from hell. The returning demon. At least Dr. Doom believed it, because right now, the breath exuding from Richard was exactly the same as the demon he had seen in hell, and even had a hint of ancient meaning. For a time, Dr. Doom, who had a grim look on his face, suddenly softened a bit, and looked at Richard with a cautious look. As the saying goes, dragons do not live with snakes. As a genius who surpassed the entire era, Dr. Destruction, with the body of a mortal, forcibly penetrated the study of magic, so his heart can be said to be full of pride. So even if he was limited by his clone before and could not exert any strength, he still looked down at Richard with an aloof attitude. And now Richard, reporting the identity of the devil, instantly closed the gap, and made Dr. Doom, for the time being, agree with him. Your Excellency is right. I am indeed in hell. Can you tell me my real name? While answering Richard's question, Dr. Doom asked quietly. And when Richard heard this, a strange color flashed in his eyes. Richard doesn't know much about Western mythology, but he knows one thing, that is, no demon will casually tell others his real name. Because the real name is the most important thing a demon has besides life. Once known by others, there are too many means to counteract the demon whose real name is revealed, so Richard sneered and looked at Dr. Destruction and said, "You can call me the Lord." Ignoring the ridicule in Richard's eyes, Dr. Doom knew that it was absolutely impossible for Richard to reveal his real name, and the reason why he asked this was just for a final test. Now it seems that Richard should not have deceived him. He is indeed the reincarnation of a demon, otherwise it would be impossible to be so cautious and only say a title. But why has he never heard of the title of Holy Lord? He has read all the magic knowledge of ancient and modern times, especially about hell. He knows much more than ordinary people, but at this moment he can't think of any demon that can match the title of Holy Master. For a time, a trace of doubt appeared on Dr. Doom's face, and at the same time, he opened his mouth to try again. I don't know where the Holy Master came from, where does come from? Hearing this, Richard knew that the real highlight was coming. The reason why he wants to create a demon identity is to use this identity to subdue Dr. Doom. So now the identity he made up is naturally the stronger, the more mysterious the best. Richard still has some confidence in his heart. After all, the identity he created is indeed a demon's past, but it is not a demon in this world. After clearing the thoughts in his mind, Richard's aura suddenly changed, vast and ancient, exuding bursts of dragon power, and his tone could not help but bring a special mood, which made people listen carefully. In ancient times, the gates of death opened wide, and the 8 demons came out of hell to rule the world. After thousands of years, the people of heaven are greedy for the faith of the world, so they came to the world and started a holy war with us. This holy war lasted for 100 years, and the world fell apart because of this, and the temple of heaven was overturned by us. At the critical moment, the Lord came and exiled us to the endless void, ending our rule. Richard's tone was full of vicissitudes, and the expression on his face carried a trace of memory, as if he was really recalling the past glory. And Dr. Doom was greatly shocked. In ancient times, it was an era that was completely disconnected from the present. No one knew what happened in that era. Could it be that the person in front of him is the devil of that era? And Yahweh, does the so-called God really exist? After sinking into for 100 years, Dr. Doom has seen too many demons, but has not seen so-called angels. Could it be that the angel disappeared because of the ancient war? The amount of information that Richard revealed was too great, and for a while Dr. Destroyed, the whole person fell silent. Looking at his appearance, Richard's face remained unchanged, but his heart had already blossomed with a smile. The best lie in the world is that 9 points are true and 1 point is false. The 8 great demons do exist. It is also true that they once ruled the earth, and it is also true that they were finally expelled. It's just that these things happen in other worlds. As for the so-called angel, Richard used to replace the original undead god. Because compared to the undead god, Richard felt that Dr. Doom should be more accepting of the setting of angels, and it seems to be working well now. Without giving Dr. Doom much time to think, Richard finally revealed his purpose at this moment. Now that I have returned from the endless nothingness, I still need to rescue several other brothers and sisters. If you help me, this seat can fulfill one of your wishes in the future. Any wish, what do you think? Richard's bewitching voice sounded slowly, and after hearing this, Dr. Doom's expression suddenly shook, and his face suddenly showed hesitation and struggle. Seeing this, Richard knew that his words had worked. What he said just now was not without purpose. In the description given by the system, it was already marked that Dr. Doom would embark on the road of magic in order to save his mother. In addition, he is currently trapped in hell, so his mother should also be imprisoned in hell. And after creating a powerful ancient demon identity, Dr. Destruction, who is eager to save his mother, has no reason to give up his help. Although everything Richard wrote was an empty check, it did not prevent Richard's appearance from giving hope to Dr. Doom. Of course, Richard also considered whether Dr. Doom had rescued his mother, but this idea was quickly rejected by Richard. If Dr. Doom had rescued his mother, he wouldn't be trapped in now. So Richard is very sure that Dr. Doom will agree, because this has become his obsession, making it impossible for him to give up. After Richard finished speaking, the atmosphere between the two suddenly became quiet, and the expression on Dr. Doom's face kept changing, obviously thinking. And Richard did not force him further to make a choice, lest it backfire. Finally, after quite a while, Dr. Doom's eyes fixed, he looked up at Richard, and Richard's heart instantly lifted, but his face was still calm. "I hope to get your help, Your Excellency." Hearing the name of Dr. Doom, Richard suddenly laughed, which means that Dr. Doom has completely recognized the identity of the demon he created and is willing to surrender to him. At the same time, the sound of the system sounded just right. Mission: recruit Alliance members. Target: Dr. Doom. Explanation: this is a genius beyond the times. In order to save his mother, he mastered magic and science with the power of mortals. Systematic review: 2-star member, strongly recommended to be accepted. Reward: 2 draws. Note: he is a cunning guy, the one you see may not be the real him. Ding: congratulations on completing the task, the reward has been issued, please check it yourself. Hearing the system prompt in his mind, Richard was full of joy. But right now, Richard has no time to deal with the meeting system, so he can only keep it in his heart for the time being. Today, the true body of Dr. Doom is still trapped in hell, and even if the consciousness of the body comes, it cannot last for too long. Therefore, after surrendering to Richard and getting the promise that Richard would help him in the future, Dr. Doom's consciousness receded. And as the consciousness of Dr. Doom left, the consciousness belonging to Scotto also suddenly woke up. Looking at Richard standing in front of him, Victor didn't panic anymore, but greeted respectfully, "Your Excellency." Although the avatar and the main body are theoretically a person, in fact there is a difference between the master and the slave. For example, the main body can know everything about the clone, but the clone can only know the information that the main body wants him to know. Listening to Victor's words, it is obvious that Dr. Doom has told Victor the identity of the devil created by Richard. Richard naturally didn't care about this, he just kept looking at Victor up and down with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. And Victor clearly noticed the strange color in Richard's eyes, and said a little strangely, "Your Excellency, why are you looking at me like this?" Hearing this, Richard smiled and didn't say anything, just a thought, and suddenly activated the power of the chicken charm, and Victor's whole body instantly floated up. The sudden scene made Victor's expression change, and he looked at Richard with panic in his eyes, obviously not knowing why Richard suddenly attacked him. And Richard's words sounded slowly at this moment, and his tone was full of ridicule. "I've seen a lot of acting schools, but you're the first one who can almost fool me." As soon as these words came out, Victor's pupils shrank for a while, but he denied it. Lord, what do you mean? Do you want to tear up the agreement with the main body?" Victor said in a questioning tone, with a hint of disbelief on his face, as if he couldn't understand Richard's actions. When Richard watched Victor's performance, he couldn't help but applauded, and said with a hint of exclamation, "No need to act, I already know your purpose, you want to replace the body, right?" As soon as these words came out, the atmosphere at the scene suddenly fell silent, and Victor, who was struggling in midair, stopped in an instant. A streak of electric light appeared on his body, and at the same time, a silver-white color gradually appeared on his body, and the whole person had a faint tendency to steal. Seeing this, Richard further confirmed his guess. Because of the system mission, Richard focused all his attention on Dr. Doom, so he didn't pay much attention to Victor. But when talking with Dr. Doom just now, Richard was keenly aware that Dr. Doom couldn't use his body power through his clone at all, so what happened to Victor, the villain? The person who can make the system take the initiative to suggest and absorb must be the villain, there is no doubt about that. Originally, Richard thought that Victor became the villain by borrowing the power of the body, but now it seems that this is not the case. Then Victor, who is the villain, naturally cannot be an ordinary person. That's why Richard suddenly started the scene. Sure enough, the fact is not what Richard expected, and now Victor is showing great power. Electric light roamed around him, making him look like the thunder had descended into the world. At the same time, Victor's icy gaze also fell on Richard's body at the moment, puzzled. How did you find out? I always thought that I was well hidden, and I didn't even notice the body. Richard smiled at this, and didn't mean to explain. Looking at Victor, who was full of aggression, Richard shook his head and said, "You are not my opponent, so don't waste your time." Hearing this, Victor naturally didn't believe it. A terrifying electric light instantly circulated on his body, and a lightning bolt struck Richard directly. There was a sudden explosion in the air, and the power of thunder and lightning was evident at this moment. Seeing this, Richard's eyes turned cold, and the terrifying flame spewed out directly with Richard's wave, and finally turned into a fire dragon. The flame and the lightning collided, both of which are extremely aggressive forces, and bursts of roars erupted in an instant, and the ground around them seemed to be baptized by missiles, and they shattered. Under the impact of the fire dragon, the lightning was directly swallowed by the fire dragon, and then the fire dragon was castrated and directly hit Victor, who was controlled by Richard. Faced with the baptism of flames, the body of steel was burned red in a short period of time, making Victor's body of steel feel like it was about to melt. Roar! A roar full of pain came from Victor's mouth. Although his body had turned into steel, it didn't mean that he no longer felt the pain. When the body of steel is severely damaged, he will still feel the pain, and the pain is thousands of times stronger than before. Boom! A loud bang sounded. Richard withdrew the power of the chicken charm, and Victor's body fell directly from the air, hitting the ground heavily. Red-hot steel body makes him extremely vulnerable now, so he doesn't dare to move at all. After doing all this, Richard raised his legs and walked towards Victor, finally stopped in front of Victor, looked at him condescendingly and said, "Don't be so impulsive, I'm not your enemy, I can even help you." Quote. Hearing this, Victor endured the pain and sneered, "You have already reached an agreement with the main body. If you tore up the agreement, do you think I will still believe you?" Hearing this, Richard raised his brows lightly and said indifferently, "Who said I want to tear up the agreement? You two are one person after all. I can make an agreement with him, and I can also make an agreement with you, and I will also keep my promise. As for what happens in the end, it's all up to you, isn't it?" As soon as Richard finished speaking, Victor was stunned. For a while, he was speechless, not knowing what to say. And Richard didn't continue to explain him. He believed that Victor would figure it out sooner or later. As the high temperature on Victor cooled, he slowly stood up while lying on the ground. He didn't continue to work. Obviously he had accepted what Richard said, and immediately said, "It's not just the four of them who caused the genetic mutation because of cosmic rays, I was also on the spaceship at that time. Those four idiots, after gaining power, actually want to change back to their original state and abandon this power, so I want you to help me and capture their special power. As long as you help me successfully obtain their special power, from now on, I will listen to you. As for the matter between me and the main body, I don't need your intervention, I will solve it myself." Faced with this request, Richard thought for a moment, then agreed with a smile, "Your request is very simple, I will help you take down the four of them. As for how to get the power you want from them, this is only you can do it yourself." For this, Victor nodded directly, indicating that there is no problem. After negotiating the conditions, the two did not stay in the Rambo building, and he left the Rambo building directly. Although their goal is now on the roof, Victor has no intention of starting now. It takes a little research time just because Victor obtains the special power of the instrument. Moreover, he was only injured by Richard before. Although he seems to be recovering now, he is still unable to fight with all his strength. So this thing needs some preparation time. And for this, Richard is not in a hurry. It doesn't matter when he is anyway, so he doesn't mind and waits until Victor is ready. Leaving Victor's contact information, Richard did not stay outside, and chose to go home. Entering his room through the window, without making any noise, Richard quickly took off his clothes, shoes and socks, lay on the bed, and couldn't wait to summon the system panel. Character Attributes Panel. Name: Richard Fisk. Age: 9 years old. Status: son of Wilson Fisker. Skills: Ninja Core, Claw Core, Giant Shadow Core, Sheep Charm, Snake Charm, Dragon Charm, Chicken Charm, Rabbit Charm. Items: none. Sweepstakes: twice. Members of the Dark Alliance: Dr. Octopus, Spider-Man, Dr. Doom. Looking at the number of draws twice, Richard chose the draw without any hesitation. During the waiting time, Richard's heart was like a cat scratching, and he was looking forward to what he would get this time. In just 1 minute, it seems like a year has passed at this moment. Finally, the cold voice of the system pulled Richard's thoughts back. Ding! Congratulations on getting the item Cup of Life. Hearing the voice in his head, Richard was stunned. This was the first time he had acquired something other than skills. If I remember correctly, the Cup of Life is also a treasure in the anime. Taking the water in the cup can make people young and have eternal life. The side effect is that the water of life in the Cup of Life must be taken every once in a while, otherwise the whole person will quickly decay. So this looks like a treasure, but it's actually a monster. Thinking of this, Richard couldn't help summoning the Cup of Life from the system, and suddenly a cup made of gold appeared in Richard's hands. The whole body is golden yellow, and there are gems inlaid on it, which looks more like a work of art. Who would have thought that as long as ordinary water is poured into it and then drank it, eternal life can be obtained? These things are of no use to Richard's personal strength improvement, but may work wonders in other areas. People are always afraid of death. I don't know how many people have longed for immortality since ancient times. Richard, who has mastered the Cup of Life, is equivalent to mastering the key to eternal life. What a temptation! There was a strange light in his eyes. Although he was a little surprised that he had drawn the Cup of Life, Richard was still very satisfied. At the same time, he was looking forward to the next lottery. Start the lottery. Giving the order in his mind again, Richard had a faint feeling in his heart that what he extracted once was still an item. Soon, the cold voice of the system sounded again, which also verified Richard's hunch. Ding! Congratulations on getting the item Penku treasure box. Hearing what he had extracted this time, Richard's expression suddenly changed, and a look of surprise appeared on his little face. The Penku treasure box, in the original book, is the key to open the door to hell, a well-deserved artifact. But what's the use of this stuff in Marvel? Could it be possible to open the door to Marvel's hell? Strange thoughts flashed in his mind, and a burst of disappointment flooded Richard's heart. He didn't think of the function of Penku's treasure box for a while, so he put it in his hand and studied it for a while, and then included it in the system. After exhausting the number of lottery draws, Richard fell into a deep sleep. And when Richard fell asleep, the three of Taylor were sitting in the conference room at the headquarters of Wall Street Hell's Kitchen, waiting for news. Very soon the door of the conference room was pushed open, and a member of Hell's Kitchen walked in quickly and said respectfully, "There is news from below, Manly Avenue, everything is safe tonight, and nothing happened." Hearing this, the faces of the three of Taylor sank, and they waved their hands to let the reporting personnel go down. Wilson then frowned and looked at Taylor and said, "What's going on? Those superheroes didn't do it." Listening to Wilson's questioning, Tyler was also angry. "How do I know? You ask me, who do I ask?" Seeing the two arguing, Vickers patted the table heavily. "Stop arguing, those superheroes didn't do anything, what should we do now?" As soon as these words came out, the conference room suddenly became quiet, and everyone was a little silent. At this moment, the door of the conference room was suddenly pushed open again. Taylor, who was in a fit of anger, shouted sharply without looking at it, "Didn't I tell you? Let you go out?" Hearing this, Char, who walked in slowly from the door, still had a simple and honest smile on his face, but his eyes looked very cold. "I think you want to give me an explanation. No one can take the benefits of our Hydra without doing anything." Char's voice sounded, and when the three people in the conference room turned to look at the door, the expressions of the three of them froze at the same time. The appearance of Char made the three of Taylor extremely embarrassed for a time. They opened their mouths and wanted to defend themselves, but all the words stopped in their mouths, but they couldn't say anything. Hydra provided them with new equipment and all kinds of support, and they ended up taking the benefits instead of working. Even if the three of them have always been thick-faced and dark-hearted people, they are embarrassed to refute Char's words at this moment. Of course, the most important thing is that Hydra can't afford to offend them. Not everyone is Kim Bing, and no, everyone has a son like Kim Bing. Compared with a global terrorist organization like Hydra, the so-called Hell's Kitchen is just an ant, so facing Char's censure, they can only bear it obediently. After pretending to be grandson for a long time, when Char finished speaking, they finally found the time to speak. Don't be angry, Mr. Char. It's not that I intend to shirk the blame. It's just that Mr. Char also knows how strong Jin Bing's power is, so we need to plan carefully. Hearing this, a sneer appeared on Char's face. Really? Then I don't know if you have a plan. Or do you plan to keep planning? As soon as this remark came out, Taylor couldn't say a word that was scolded. And Wilson also quickly opened his mouth and said, "We have already planned, we will start the action tomorrow, please give us a little more time from Mr. Char." Wilson made a promise, and Char nodded immediately and said, "If that's the case, then I'll give you a little more time. I hope you can bring me good news, otherwise trust me, you may not be able to see me next time." After that, Char didn't stop there, turned around and left the conference room and the building at the same time. After watching Char leave, Taylor patted the table and stood up. "Do it tomorrow. What are we going to do with Jin?" Saying that, Taylor turned his attention to Wilson, who made the promise. And Wilson was also not to be outdone. He got up and shouted, "If you don't say that, what else can you do? Or do you think Hydra really dare not kill people?" Looking at the two people who were about to quarrel again, Vickers, who had a look of irritability on his face, immediately knocked on the table. "Okay, stop arguing. No matter how strong Jin Bing is, it is not without opponents. This is the end of the matter. We can only fight against him by uniting all the forces that are hostile to Jin Bing." Vickers' words made Tyler calm down instantly, but it also made their brows wrinkle at the same time. In Taylor's tone, there was a rare hesitation. "You mean those two lunatics?" Vickers nodded silently. Wilson also questioned at this moment, "Are you sure the two lunatics will join forces with us? Instead of us being killed by the two lunatics first? You must know that their attitude towards us is not much different from that of Jin Bing. If you want to unite with them, be careful to trap yourself." Vickers was not surprised by the attitude of the two, and even his heart was full of hesitation. If he had a choice, he would never unite those two lunatics. In the underground world, in addition to Jin Bing, there are two people who are most famous and feared by everyone. Daredevil, Matthew Murdock, was blinded by an accident, but his other senses have been greatly strengthened, whether it is hearing, smell or sixth sense far beyond ordinary people. Coupled with his extremely high physical fitness and extreme fighting skills, his strength can be said to be extremely amazing. Because of the influence of the growing environment and the murder of his father by people in the underground world, Matthew took the path of dark justice, and later became the leader of the Hand. In addition to him, the other person is Frank Custer, known as the Punisher. He was originally a member of the Marine Corps, but because he witnessed the death of his child and his wife at the hands of the underground world personnel, he finally embarked on the journey. The road to justice that overcomes violence with violence. Both of them are rare dark heroes in Marvel, and they treat criminals with extremely cruel methods, so behind their illustrious reputation, everyone is afraid. For such a person, it is too late for the various forces in the underground world to hide, let alone take the initiative to cooperate. But now, under the pressure of Hydra, even Taylor or Wilson, no matter how reluctant, finally had to nod and agree with Vickers' proposal. Because it's the only way. So the question is, who will contact these two? Faced with this question, Taylor and Wilson turned their attention to Vickers at the same time. Facing the gazes of the two, Vickers still didn't know what idea they were fighting, but the solution was proposed by him, so it could only be solved by him. At the moment, Vickers nodded and said, "Diaresis, I will contact them and hope there will be a good result." After speaking, Vickers got up and left the conference room. Watching his leaving back, Wilson and Taylor looked at each other and shrugged at the same time. After leaving the headquarters of Hell's Kitchen, Vickers, who was sitting in the vehicle, fell into silence. Don't look at his sultry appearance and Yi Shuihan before, but in fact, if you don't have a certain degree of certainty, how can an old fritter like him get involved in danger lightly? In fact, Vickers and Matthew have known each other since childhood, and they can be regarded as good friends. It's just that they took two completely different roads in the morning, but they finally met at the fork in the road. I have to say that fate is magical. And about this matter, Vickers has never told anyone, so Vickers still has a certain degree of confidence in persuading Matthew. Even if it is bad, it is enough to ensure his own safety. When I came to the slum by car, the slum at night, good money is good, was quiet. From time to time, there would be a roar of motorcycles on the road, as well as the loud shouts of some beasts. The vehicle that Vickers was riding in, after entering the slum, finally stopped in front of a house. The houses here are full of the style of the 1980s. The small courtyard is covered with moss geckos, but it can be seen that the small courtyard has been well taken care of, so it has both the atmosphere of the times and the modernity, convenience. Pushing open the car door and walking down, Vickers let out a slow breath, and then walked into the small courtyard. Just came to the door, and before Vickers knocked on the door, a young voice suddenly came from the house. "Come in, the door is unlocked to eat." Hearing this, Vickers paused when he was about to knock on the door, then pushed open the door and walked in, just to see a blindfolded young man wiping a dagger. The blindfolded young man is naturally the legendary daredevil, Matthew Murdoch. Listening to the footsteps coming from the door, Matthew's face did not show any unnecessary expression. As the saying goes, when God closes a door for you, he will surely open a window for you. Matthew, who has lost his eyesight, not only has his senses greatly enhanced, but his mind is also sharper than before. Therefore, although he could not see the appearance of the person coming, Matthew had already judged the identity of the person coming from the footsteps alone. "Vickers, you haven't been here for a long time, why did you suddenly come to me today? Aren't you afraid that I will kill you?" Matthew's tone was flat, but Vickers knew he wasn't joking. But even so, Vickers was not afraid, because he also knew that Matthew would not kill himself. "You know, I'm like a rat crossing the street right now, running for my life all day." Regarding Vickers' statement, Matthew did not know if he could. After he finished speaking, he asked again, "Tell me, what are you doing here with me?" Hearing this, Vickers sorted out the wording, and then slowly said, "We have to deal with Jinbing, but our strength alone is not enough, so I want to invite you together." Hearing Jinbing's name, Matthew's movements suddenly tensed, and the originally dull look on his face also showed a hint of coldness. Since Peter was blackened by Richard, Matthew has become Jinbing's #1 enemy, and Matthew has also made Jinbing his biggest target. But even so, Matthew never thought to cooperate with others, let alone with Hell's Kitchen, a group of villains who are no better than Jin. However, having said that, Matthew did not refuse immediately because he wanted to hear how Vickers would impress him. Seeing that Matthew didn't speak, Vickers hesitated and continued, "Let's be honest, it's not only us who have to deal with Jinbing this time, but also Hydra. They need some things in Jinbing's hands, but due to the big commotion that Jinbing made some time ago, they are not suitable to come forward directly, so we can only muddy the water first. But they will definitely fight against Kim anyway, and we might really be able to take this opportunity to eradicate Kim. I know you hate all of us, but I think you hate Jinbing even more, because it was his men who killed your father in the first place. So, CGFB, if you want to eradicate Jinbing, this is the best opportunity, otherwise once you miss this opportunity, I think you should know how hard it is to eradicate Jinbing." Vickers put all his chips on the table, and Matthew really fell silent this time. He had to admit that he was moved by Vickers' words, that Kim was the guy he wanted to deal with more than anyone else. However, Jin is unfathomable in both strength and power. With his own power alone, there is little hope of dealing with Jin. Therefore, after being silent for a while, Matthew finally nodded and said, "Since this is the case, then I will cooperate with you once, but only on this matter." Hearing this, Wixton laughed. Fortunately things weren't too bad. But his purpose this time is not just to invite Matthew, but more importantly, to invite Frank the Punisher through Matthew. Therefore, seeing that Matthew agreed, Vickers hit the railroad while it was hot. "Speaking of this matter, I would like to ask you a favor and invite the Punisher to participate in this operation. You know, with every additional person, we have a better chance of winning." For this request, Matthew did not refuse. After thinking about it, he nodded and agreed. In fact, even if Vickers didn't say it, Matthew would invite the Punisher, so this request was not difficult. To get two things done in one go, Wixton breathed a sigh of relief. Compared to Matthew, facing the Punisher is a more terrifying thing. Now that he doesn't have to come forward in person, his safety is guaranteed. They didn't stay any longer, the two discussed it, and after tomorrow's action time, Vickers took the initiative to bid farewell. Not long after Vickers left, Matthew also put on his equipment and left the house to invite Frank the Punisher. And just after the two left one after another, neither of them noticed that a bald man suddenly walked out of Matthew's small courtyard. An icon was drawn on the forehead of the bald man. Like a target, it was the bullseye, the #1 assassin under Jin Bing. Jin has been able to reach today step by step, never underestimating any opponent. Therefore, when Richard told him about the intelligence that Peter had inquired during the day, Jin Bian had already responded. Directly ordered Bullseye, who had just returned to New York City, to find out the location of everyone, collect all intelligence information, and prepare to catch them all. And Bullseye, who happened to sneak into the building, heard all their plans, and finally followed Vickers and found Matthew's residence. It has to be said that the people in Hell's Kitchen are utterly unlucky. Because of meeting Peter, their information was leaked, and Peter told Richard, Richard told Jin Bing, and finally Jin Bing sent Bullseye to overhear their plan and information again. It can only be said that all this can be said to be destined. Looking at the direction in which Vickers and Matthew disappeared, Bullseye did not continue to follow. A cruel smile slowly appeared on his face, his figure disappeared into the darkness, and soon disappeared. Time passed, and soon the night faded, dawn enveloped the earth again, and New York City, an international metropolis, gradually became prosperous. In the Emperor Building, Jin Bing sat indifferently on the office chair, looked at the Bullseye standing respectfully in front of him, and asked in a flat tone, "How is the investigation going? Find out what happened to those mice. Is it the location?" When the words fell, Bullseye laughed suddenly, with a hint of ridicule in his tone. "I've figured it out, all of them are hiding on Wall Street, and I've also heard some interesting things. They plan to join the blind man and the lunatic to deal with you." Lester spoke respectfully and described in detail what happened last night. After listening to Bullseye's words, Jin tapped the table with his fingers and fell into deep thought. After thinking for too long, Jin Bing quickly recovered from his thoughts, with a disdainful smile on his mouth, and commanded, "Let the people below get ready and give them a big gift. Since they took the initiative to give come to the door, you don't have to leave this time, remember, I want to catch it all." When the words fell, Ba Yan nodded and said, "I understand, Mr. Wilson." Bullseye left Jin Bing's office and went down to prepare. On the other hand, the people of Hell's Kitchen also started to act. As the saying goes, a tiger's cannot be touched, and this time they not only have to touch the tiger's butt, but also break a tooth out of the tiger's mouth, so naturally they must prepare well in advance. The three of Taylor convened the backbone of Hell's Kitchen to formulate and improve the action plan for tonight. In the gym next to them, Matthew and Frank are fighting, making final preparations for the night's battle. The two are both dark heroes, and they naturally meet each other on weekdays, so when Matthew came to the door last night, Frank nodded and agreed without any hesitation. So early this morning, the two came to the headquarters of Hell's Kitchen. The three of Taylor didn't mind either. Regardless of whether the operation tonight was successful or not, they had to change the headquarters, so naturally they didn't mind Matthew and Frank entering this place. The two forces are making the final preparations, and the Hydra standing behind Hell's Kitchen is naturally not idle. The information about Jin Bing had already been checked upside down by them, so after a series of discussions, Hydra directly targeted Jin Bing's son Richard. They need all kinds of technology in Jinbo's hands, so threatening Jinbo is the best option. And if they want to threaten Jin and the Underground Emperor, they naturally need a serious threat object. So Richard came into their sight. As I said before, Richard has done a lot of things, but most of them are attributed to Jin Bing, so few people know Richard's true face. In this way, in the intelligence data investigated by Hydra, Richard was just an ordinary child. So after Richard's school that day, Charles waited early at the campus gate. As for Daniel, who was in charge of picking up Charles in the past, he was stuck on the road by a car accident at the moment. When Richard walked out of the school gate, Charlton, who had been waiting at the school gate for a while, his eyes lit up. "Hello Richard, Daniel has other business today, so your father specially asked me to pick you up." Hearing this, looking at Char in front of him, the corner of Richard's expressionless face twitched slightly. Kidnapping, blackmail, threaten. 3 consecutive questions suddenly appeared in Richard's mind. But soon Richard put the unrealistic idea out of his head. Since he can find out his identity, ordinary kidnappers don't have the courage to kidnap him, so the person in front of him must be a force no weaker than Jin Bing. There are very few forces in New York City that can rival Jinping. Except for S.H.I.E.L.D., which has been extremely low-key, I am afraid that there are only Hydra hidden in the dark, so Char's identity suddenly ready to come out. And Char, who was looking at Richard with a smile on his face, could not have imagined that if he was killed, Richard had already guessed the power behind him. Looking at Richard, who was standing in the same place without saying a word, I don't know if it was an illusion, Charles always felt that Richard seemed to see himself transparently. This feeling was inexplicable, and Charles couldn't help but laugh at himself. How is this possible? Shaking his head and throwing this strange thought out of his mind, Charles urged again, "Come with me." As he spoke, Char looked around from the corner of his eye, for fear that a person of gold would suddenly appear. Because they did not find any protective force beside Richard, the Hydra people felt very strange, which made Char also sensitive. Facing Char's urging, the thoughts in Richard's mind turned for a while, and a pure smile appeared on his face. "Okay, uncle." After speaking, Richard took the initiative to walk towards Char's vehicle. Seeing this, a touch of joy suddenly appeared in Char's eyes. Things went more smoothly than he thought, and now Char couldn't wait to get into the driver's seat and drove the vehicle away from the campus gate. Inside the car, the atmosphere seemed a little quiet at the moment. Richard leaned on the back seat and looked at Charles, who was driving suddenly, and said, "Isn't this the way home?" As soon as the words fell, Char's arm froze, but he quickly said with a calm expression, "I usually take that road, but there was a car accident today, so we took a different road." Katakana middle dot 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 katakana middle dot. While explaining, Charles looked through the rearview mirror and looked at Richard's reaction in the back seat. Seeing Richard's soft snort, he believed his explanation, and the heart that Charles had just mentioned was relieved. Although Richard had already got into the car and his task was considered completed, Charles didn't want to expose it unless it was a last resort, so as not to cause extra trouble. After he took his eyes back, Richard, who was sitting in the back seat, suddenly showed a playful smile on the corner of his mouth. Naturally, what he said just now was deliberately said, without any special purpose, just to scare him out of boredom. At this moment, Richard is full of expectations for what is about to happen. These people kidnap themselves to threaten Jin Bing. But how will these people react when they find out they kidnapped not a baby dragon but a giant dragon? Thinking about it makes Richard find it interesting, and that's why he cooperates with Char like this. After all, the dull time has passed for too long, and an occasional small game is also a good remedy. As for Richard's thoughts, Char is doomed to be unknown. When the car drove into a villa area, Char was hesitating how to explain, but Richard had already pushed open the car door and walked out. This scene changed Char's face, and he quickly got out of the car and followed up, only to see Richard just standing there and looking at the surrounding scenery, without expressing any questions, nor running around. Seeing this, a strange look flashed in Char's eyes, but he still said, "Come with me, you rest here first, Mr. Wilson will come to pick you up later." As he spoke, Charles stepped forward and took Richard's hand and led him to a villa, and Richard was also very well behaved at the moment, like a well-behaved baby, without any rebuttal. When he came to the villa, before Charles knocked on the door, the villa door had already opened. Richard looked up and saw the camera hanging on the door. He just grinned at the camera, and then followed Charles into the villa. Night is the protective color of evil, and it is also a battle. When the killing is the best, whether it is Jin Ning or Hell's Kitchen, it is impossible to choose the fighting time in the daytime. After all, the Star-Striped Federation is the boss on the bright side. So when the whole day passed and night fell again, Hell's Kitchen started its action. Hell's Kitchen's goal is very clear: to make a move to attract Jin Bing's attention, contain the forces of Jin Bing, and create opportunities for Hydra to fish in troubled waters. So in order to achieve this goal, the forces of Hell's Kitchen were divided into 3 parts, namely Invasion, Manton District, Queens District, and Bronx District. These 3 areas belong to the core area of Jin Bing's power. Jin Bing has a large number of industries here. Once these 3 areas are attacked, it is enough to attract Jin Bing's attention. Of course, the risks are not without. It is precisely because these places are at the core of Jinbian's 070 forces, so as long as one is not careful, the people in Hell's Kitchen are very likely to be dumped by Jinbing, and they can't escape even if they want to run. But in this regard, the 3 of Taylor are not very worried, because Hydra has made a promise to them and will help them evacuate afterwards. It is precisely because of this guarantee that they dared to blatantly tease the tiger's beard. As groups of teams left from Wall Street, Vickers, who was standing on the top floor watching this scene, couldn't help but have a look of worry on his face. This time, in order to ensure the smooth operation, Taylor and Wilson personally led their subordinates to attack, while Vickers was responsible for staying at the headquarters and transferring the headquarters. Although the 3 of them have always been incompatible with each other, they even wished to kill each other's forces that devoured each other's subordinates. But tonight, Vickers didn't have any such thoughts, he just hoped that their actions would go smoothly. After watching batches of teams leave, Vickers turned his head with a headache and looked at the 2 behind him, Matthew and Frank. Being in charge of transferring the headquarters can be said to be the safest part, and neither Taylor nor Wilson has competed with Vickers for such an errand. The only reason is because of these 2. They don't move with the big army, nor do they move with them. Although the 2 sides have reached cooperation in name, the fact is that neither of the 2 sides can abandon their former suspicions and truly cooperate, so the 2 of them were left at the headquarters as support forces. Therefore, the person responsible for transferring the headquarters must also stay with them. And both Wilson and Taylor felt that it was too dangerous to stay with these 2 lunatics, for fear that they would kill themselves directly. Therefore, they would rather lead their forces to dispatch than stay at the headquarters. In the end, this errand can only fall on Vickers. Vickers didn't feel it before, but now, seeing only himself, Matthew and Frank in the entire conference room, it was inevitable that he felt a little nervous. But fortunately, he met Matthew, so Vickers's heart also settled a lot. And just 10 minutes after the large number of people in Hell's Kitchen left, a strong man in a black suit suddenly appeared around the street and surrounded the headquarters of Hell's Kitchen. These people were holding firearms in their hands, and there were more than 100 people. After showing up, they went straight to the building of the Hell's Kitchen headquarters. As these people poured into the building, the door of a car on the side of the road was also opened, and a black man jumped out of the car with a grim look on his face. His name is Zach Miller, and he is a general under Jin Bing. He was also injected with super serum and survived the last battle with S.H.I.E.L.D. The order he received this time was to remove all the people in the building in front of him. So it was not until the forces of Hell's Kitchen were completely dispersed that Miller chose to do it. Since the headquarters of Hell's Kitchen will be moved after tonight's action, there are still many people from Hell's Kitchen in the building. They organize all kinds of information, which are secrets in Hell's Kitchen, and they also need to be transferred. But just as they were busy with the business at hand, disaster struck in an instant. 100 strong men in black broke into the building with guns in their hands, killing anyone they saw. As the gunshots rang out, many of the Hell's Kitchen personnel had been beaten into sieves by bullets before they could react. So the corpses fell to the ground, and the people who survived the first round of gunfire also responded. At the back of their fast building, a loud roar spread throughout the entire floor at the same time. Fake, someone broke in. Counterattack, fight back. Ah, my legs, save me. Roaring and screaming mixed, the entire building instantly turned into a pot of porridge. On the top floor of the building, Vickers vaguely heard some movement, but because the floor was too high, it was not very real. Before he could listen carefully, Matthew and Frank, who were sitting not far away from him, rubbed a little and stood up from their positions. Because Matthew was blind in both eyes, he strengthened all his senses, so when the gunshots sounded downstairs, he heard a real one for the first time. As for Frank, as a person who had retreated from the battlefield, his familiarity with the sound of gunfire had been thoroughly engraved in his bones, so he also reacted immediately. Problem occurs, Matthew sounded with a dignified voice. Frank nodded, while Vickers was a little dumbfounded and asked subconsciously, "What's going on here? Why would someone raid us?" As soon as the words fell, Frank gave Vickers a deep look, as if to see something on his face, and his eyes gradually became cold. Seeing this scene, Matthew took a step to stand in front of Frank, and explained at the same time, "It wasn't him who betrayed us, otherwise he wouldn't stay here." Hearing this, Frank nodded hesitantly, agreeing with Matthew's statement. And Vickers reacted only after realizing it at this moment. His eyes widened, and there was a look of disbelief on his face. "You mean that someone leaked the information, and now it's Jin Bing who is raiding us?" Hearing this, Matthew nodded, but Vickers seemed a little unacceptable. "How is this possible? Until this morning, we only announced the content of the action, and only a few of us knew the content of the action before that. And if someone tipped off, then Jin Bian should have found us long ago. Why did he come to the door now?" Vickers was puzzled, and Frank, who had listened to his words, said sharply, "That's because someone eavesdropped on your news, and it was just last night." After the words fell, Matthew's face changed instantly, becoming extremely ugly. "How many people were you when you went to find me last night?" Matthew's voice sounded, and Victor was stunned for a moment, but he quickly reacted and stretched out a finger and said, "I am the only one." As soon as these words came out, Matthew's face sank. "But I heard the footsteps of 2 people last night, I thought it was the one you brought." As soon as this statement came out, things became clear in an instant, and their plan was leaked, so it is not surprising that they are being called to the door now. Looking at Vickers with an ugly face, Frank opened his mouth and reminded, "You'd better notify them to cancel the operation now, otherwise once Jinan is ready, there will be no Hell's Kitchen tomorrow." Listening to Frank's reminder, Vickers still didn't move, but his voice was a little difficult. In order to prevent someone from leaking the news, everyone's phones were turned off, the same for Taylor and Wilson. Only after the operation started, they will turn on the phone again. Hearing this, Frank shook his head immediately. There was nothing he could do. At the same time, the gunshots coming from downstairs on the 26th floor were getting closer and closer to them. Listening to the fierce gunshots, Frank's blood began to boil, and he seemed to have returned to the battlefield filled with gunpowder. When the face licked the corner of his mouth excitedly, Frank turned and walked towards the door. Seeing this, Matthew followed immediately. Watching the two walk out of the conference room one after the other, Vickers took a deep breath and also took out the pistol from his waist. No one cares about anyone now, so he can only rely on himself. If you want to survive, you must kill them. Once they are blocked on the top floor, they have nowhere to run. The 3 of them saw this very clearly, so no one asked any silly questions. And just as the 3 of them walked downstairs, the killing downstairs was gradually coming to an end. Jin and the party belonged to the raid, and one by one also carried automatic firearms. In contrast, the people of Hell's Kitchen hurriedly responded and were caught off guard, so there was no effective resistance at all. When the 3 of Matthew came to the 5th floor from the top floor, the gunshots downstairs had completely stopped, and only the smell in the air slowly floated downstairs. In the darkness, both Matthew and Frank seemed very calm. They had experienced such a scene many times, and they were no longer nervous. In contrast, Vickers, who was standing behind Matthew at the moment, only felt his heart beating fast, his breathing became rapid, and the hand holding the gun even trembled slightly. Aware of his abnormality, Matthew didn't look back, but his voice came from the front. "Relax, man, the more afraid of death, the faster you will die. Only calmness can make you survive the battle." After speaking to comfort, Matthew focused his attention downstairs again, and Vickers, who was behind him, quickly calmed down after he finished speaking. Matthew, who was suddenly in the dark, slightly curled the corners of his mouth, revealing a smile. This is the Vickers he is familiar with, not the Vickers who was afraid of death just now. At the same time, after solving everyone, Jin Bing's men did not withdraw, but continued to move towards the upper floor. Soon footsteps came from downstairs, and Matthew listened carefully, quickly judging the number of people coming, and said softly, There are only 5, the others should have taken the elevator. Hearing this, Frank nodded silently, counting the time silently in his heart. Soon the footsteps downstairs were getting closer and closer to them, and the number in Frank's heart was completely 0. Immediately Frank moved, and the darkness did not affect him in any way, but made his movements silent in the darkness. Without using a firearm, Frank directly used the dagger in his hand to instantly kill the 3 strong men in black suits who had just appeared in front of them. And the 2 strong men in suits who followed behind the 3 people saw the 3 fell to the ground with their own eyes, and their expressions suddenly changed. Just as they were about to shoot, Matthew had quietly come to them, and his hands were instantly stuck. Their necks twisted. Caca. 2 bone cracks sounded, and before the 2 had time to react, they had already turned into corpses. Frank and Matthew started at almost the same time, and they solved 5 people in a short time. Vickers, who had been following behind them, swallowed hard. At this moment, he suddenly understood why Taylor and Wilson didn't want to stay with these 2 guys. Maybe in the eyes of these 2 guys, there is no difference between themselves and the 2 chickens, and they can be pinched to death. Vickers' mind was spinning with messy thoughts. Matthew and Frank didn't have time to pay attention. After solving the 5 people blocking the road, they quickly walked downstairs, and Vickers quickly followed. The further downstairs they went, the more blood they could smell, and the more ugly Vickers' face became. They didn't even have to go out of the stairwell to see what was going on outside. They could already imagine that there must be a scene of corpses lying everywhere at the moment. Frank did not have any special reaction to this, they were used to blood and death. But Vickers was heartbroken and couldn't breathe, because all those who stayed in the building belonged to him. Because the building was so big, Jin Bing's people had to sweep floor by floor, so there weren't many people in the stairwell. Counting the 5 people who were killed 640 times by Matthew and others just now, they only met 2 groups of people in total, and they were all in groups of 5. Although these people are elites for ordinary people, they are more than a little bit worse than Matthew and Frank. Therefore, they have come to the first floor without encountering any decent resistance. But here, the stairs have come to an end, and if you want to leave this building, you must go through the main entrance. Without too much hesitation, the 3 of them walked out of the stairwell, and the scene in the hall was instantly reflected in the eyes of the 3 of them. More than a dozen corpses fell to the ground, and blood slowly flowed out from these corpses. The 3 of them turned a blind eye to the 3 and quickly walked towards the main entrance. But just after arriving at the door, the 3 people's footsteps stopped instantly, and they looked at the figure standing at the door. It was none other than Jin Bing's general, Zach Miller. And just when they found Miller, Miller also saw them, and there was a hint of surprise and astonishment in his eyes. The famous Daredevil and Punisher, Miller naturally knows, and also knows that the target of tonight's action has their names. But Miller didn't expect that he would hit both of them at the same time, and with Vickers on the side, he hit 3 big fish in one go. Miller didn't know whether he should cry or laugh. The 2 sides were at the main entrance, facing each other at the door, and a dignified atmosphere spread in the air for a while. Vickers shrank and tried to make himself inconspicuous. Although he didn't know who Miller was, he could, by observing the solemn expressions on Matthew and Franklin's faces, conclude that the man in front of him was blocking their way. Black people are not easy. In the end, Miller took the initiative to speak to break the dignified atmosphere. It seems that my luck today is good, blocking 3 big fish in one breath. As soon as the words fell, Franklin sneered, "Really? You are not afraid that the fish will break the net, and then you will not know whether it is your luck or ours." As soon as the 2 opened their mouths, the air was filled with the smell of gunpowder, and a fierce light rose in their eyes at the same time. One side wants to take someone, and the other side wants to get away. The 2 sides are destined to live in peace. So at a certain moment, Miller moved. A strong sonic boom exploded instantly, and the floor beneath Miller's feet suddenly shattered where he was standing. His figure turned into an afterimage at this moment, and Frank rushed up. The fist slammed out hard, with a strong whistling sound, and for a while, a sharp sound sounded in the ears of Frank and the 3. At the same time as Miller made his move, the dagger in Frank's hand suddenly swung horizontally, and his body flashed with a knife light to face Miller's attack directly. The pupil shrank, the offensive changed, and the whole person passed by Frank's attack. After finally dodging Frank's attack, before Miller could catch his breath, Matthew, who had already taken a fighting stance, launched an attack in an instant. The two flying knives made of bamboo from blind men came out of Matthew's hands directly. Under the blessing of Matthew's powerful strength, the speed of the flying knives was no slower than that of sniper rifle bullets. And Miller, who had just forcibly reversed the offensive, did not have much time to react to the attack that followed. In the end, he could only avoid the key points and took down the two flying knives. Puff! The flying knife shot directly into his body and flew him out. Boom! The whole person slammed heavily on the ground, and Miller's face showed a look of pain, but he jumped up quickly. The whole person took a defensive posture, looked at Frank and Matthew, and did not continue to launch attack. Matthew and Frank also did not pursue the victory at this moment. The two looked at Miller vigilantly and said to Vickers without looking back, "Come on." Vickers, who was originally behind the two of them, didn't dare to ask any more questions when he heard this. He nodded hastily and quickly ran outside. At the same time, Matthew and Frank, while watching Miller vigilantly, slowly retreated outwards. And Miller just knelt on the ground halfway, watching the three of them leave, without any intention of continuing to block. After the three of them disappeared completely, Miller suddenly relaxed. As the tense nerves relaxed, a strong pain suddenly came from his abdomen, which made his look a little grim. Although the two sides only fought one move just now, Miller knew that he could not keep them, so he did not continue to block them. And Matthew and Frank are not sure to kill Miller in a short time. Once the delay is too long, Miller's men will appear, and then they will be in a real dilemma. So they also did not continue to attack. On this point, the two sides have maintained a certain tacit understanding. He pulled out the two flying knives in his abdomen, and blood immediately poured out of them, dyeing Miller's coat red in the blink of an eye. Although Miller grimaced in pain, he wasn't too worried. Injected with super serum, his cell activity far exceeds that of ordinary people. For ordinary people, it is a serious injury, but for him it can only be regarded as a minor injury. After bandaging the wound, Miller took out his mobile phone from his pocket and called Bullseye. "I met Daredevil and Punisher on Wall Street, and Vickers, one of the giants of Hell's Kitchen. I didn't stop them, let them run away, and leave the rest to you." After Miller finished speaking, on the other end of the phone, he remembered Bullseye's bloodthirsty and frantic voice, "I see." After replying, the phone was directly hung up, and Miller didn't care. Looking at his men who had already taken the elevator to the first floor, he signaled them to clear the field and retreat. On the other side, Bullseye stood on top of a tall building, looking at Hell's Kitchen, which had already begun to fall into the trap. A cruel smile suddenly appeared on the corner of his mouth. "A group of rats in the sewer are finally willing to emerge. This time I will see where you are going, and start taking action." Bullseye's order was quickly transmitted to the ears of the chiefs through the headset at the corner of his mouth, and the chiefs began to greet the people under him to set off. For a time, the Hell's Kitchen side, who had just entered the sphere of influence of Jinbing, suddenly found that there were two batches of strong men in suits in front and back of the whole street. And these people are holding black muzzles in their hands. Screams sounded for a while, but unfortunately it was too late. In the Emperor's building, Jin and Damascus sat on the office chair. Because there were many things tonight, Jin did not go home. At this moment, Daniel was standing in front of the desk tremblingly, with his head lowered and his expression terrified, completely living up to his calm appearance in the past. And he did that because Richard had been lost and had not heard from him for hours. As one of the few people who have seen Richard's true face, Daniel is naturally not worried about Richard's safety, but there is a mistake in his work, which is absolutely not allowed. Jin sent him to Richard's side. In addition to being convenient for Richard's commands, it also had the intention of letting him protect Richard. Although Richard's strength is not needed for his protection, whether Richard needs it or not is one thing, and he doesn't do it is another. So at the moment he is waiting for Jin Bing's punishment of Zhao Zhao to punish. Not letting him wait too long, Jin Bing said indifferently, "Diarisist One Finger has a long memory. Next time something like this happens, just run away." Listening to Jin Bing's words, Daniel did not hesitate, and he pulled a sharp dagger directly from his waist. The knife fell from his hand, and the little finger of his left hand fell to the ground in an instant. Suddenly, Daniel's body trembled suddenly, his face became extremely pale, and his forehead was covered in fine cold sweat. At the same time, Daniel still endured the pain and said, I understand, Mr. Wilson, there will never be a next time. I will call someone to look for it. Even if I search the whole New York City, I will definitely find Mr. Richard. Listening to Daniel's assurance, Wilson nodded. Beneath his seemingly calm face, he was actually full of tyrannical killing intent. Find those people and bring them back alive. Listening to Jin Bing's words, Daniel's body suddenly paused, and he instantly understood the meaning of Jin Bing's words. The most terrifying thing in the world is death, but there is one more terrifying thing than death, that is, life is better than death. Resisting the pain, he nodded silently. Daniel was about to leave the office, but at this moment, the phone that Jin Bing had placed on his desk suddenly rang. Daniel's footsteps stopped at the moment, and Jin Bian also turned his head to look at the phone on the table, reached out and took it over, and directly turned on the speakerphone. Mr. Wilson, good evening, sorry to disturb you at this time. Presumably, you are already overwhelmed at this moment, but I still want to cause you a trouble. Your son is in our hands, so can you please tell us where the labs for the super serum and human booster are? Hearing the unfamiliar man's voice on the phone, Jin Bing's eyes flashed and he said in a deep voice, I want to talk to Richard and give him the phone. As soon as these words came out, the other end of the phone was obviously quiet, but they soon agreed to Jin Bing's request. After a while, Richard's voice rang on the phone. His tone was very calm, even with a faint smile. Hey, Father, I didn't sneak out to play, they brought me here. Hearing Richard's indifferent words, Jin Bing's expression did not change in any way, but if you look closely, you will find that the tyranny in his eyes has lightened a lot after hearing Richard's voice. Your mother called before and asked where you were. I covered it up for you and said that you are here with me. Pay attention to the time, don't play for too long, and remember to go home early. At this moment, Jin Bing turned into a chattering loving father in an instant. Although there were not many emotional fluctuations in his tone, there was not a lot of concern in his words. Richard, who was on the other end of the phone, felt a little warm in his heart, but he didn't continue to be provocative. He simply said, understood. Then he hung up the phone. Hearing the busy tone coming from the phone, Jin Bing's eyebrows flashed a hint of helplessness. The whole New York City dared to take the initiative to hang up his phone. I dare not say that there are not at all, but there are very few. But Richard is clearly one of them. Putting down the phone, looking at Daniel who was still standing aside with a pale face, Jin Bing waved his hand. Don't look for it, Richard will handle it himself. Take your finger to the hospital, it should be too late now. Hearing this, Daniel had a forced smile on his face, but he didn't pick up the fingers on the ground. This is a lesson I have left for myself. It keeps me alert and asks Mr. Wilson to complete it. Hearing this, Jin Ning glanced at Daniel and finally nodded, and Daniel slowly exited the office. On the other side, in a certain villa, everyone in Hydra was dumbfounded when they saw the phone that Richard hung up. The 5 people in the room turned their attention to Char, and Char was also stunned at the moment. He was the one who agreed to let Richard answer the phone just now, but he didn't expect that the phone would be directly hung up by Richard. At the moment, one of them quickly took the phone from Richard's hand and wanted to dial it again. And Richard didn't stop it, just leaned on the sofa slowly, looking at several people with a smile on his face. Looking at this scene, Charles took the lead in reacting. The expression on his face changed. He turned over and quickly opened the distance from Richard. At the same time, the dark muzzle appeared in his hand, up, and pointed at Richard's head. Who are you? Char's drinking question instantly alarmed the 5 people in the room. At that moment, the 5 people stopped their movements and turned to look at Char, their eyes filled with puzzlement. Obviously for a while some incomprehensible, what Charles wants to do. But those who can join Hydra are not idiots, let alone perform this mission. They are all elites selected from among the elites. So puzzled, it only existed for a moment, and the next second, the 5 people suddenly realized, CGCJ, that something was wrong. They are the kidnappers. Shouldn't it be Jin Bing on the opposite side who should be worried? Why are they the one who is worried now? Moreover, the conversation between Richard and Jin Bing just now did not show a father's concern for his son at all, but it seemed extremely plain, which is not normal. Thinking of this, 5 dart guns were aimed at Richard's head, and the expressions of several people became extremely vigilant at this moment. Looking at everyone's appearance, Richard raised his brows slightly, and immediately spread his hands and said, "Didn't you bring me back? Why are you asking me who I am now?" As soon as these words came out, the 5 people looked at Char again, and Char's face changed slightly at this moment, and he had already felt the suspicious eyes of the 5 people. At the moment, Char didn't hesitate, and quickly defended himself. "He was indeed brought back by me, and he is also the son of Jin Bing, but what we have investigated is obviously false information. The things recorded in the information are completely different from this guy. You guys, if you don't believe me, check it out for yourself." These words were said in a hasty tone, and the doubts on the faces of the 5 people dissipated a lot, and now they turned their attention to Richard again. The 2 of them looked at each other and walked directly towards Richard. No matter how weird Richard is in front of him, as long as he takes it down, he won't be able to turn the tide, and then their plan can continue. Chapter 71. Looking at the 2 approaching, Richard reminded with a smile on his face, "I advise you to stay away from me, or you will die." Richard's immature voice sounded, but he couldn't scare the 2 members of Hydra at all. Their pace was still unhurried, and they were about to come to Richard's side and take him down. But just when the 2 were 1 step away from Richard, suddenly a sharp claw came out from their chests at the same time. Blood poured out of his chest in an instant, and behind the 2 claw shadows had appeared here at some point. And the claws protruding from the chests of the 2 Hydra members are naturally their masterpieces. Because this scene came too suddenly, the Charles who were aiming at Richard not far away did not react at all. When they came back to their senses, their 2 teammates had completely fallen to the ground, accompanied by Richard's helpless voice. "Don't come here as I told you, or you will die. You just don't listen. It's all right now, let's die." After speaking, Richard sighed, as if he was sad for the 2 people who died, but the exposed smile at the corner of his mouth proved that he did it on purpose. The atmosphere of dead silence permeated the whole room. Char and several people watched the claw shadow suddenly appear. The muscles in the corners of their eyes twitched wildly, and their eyes flashed with unbelievable colors. How did they get in? Why didn't the alarm system go off? New capable person. Extraordinary person. Why did before? All kinds of doubts rose in the minds of several people, but their hands holding the gun were still very stable. Even if what happened just now made them feel extremely unbelievable, their guns aimed at Chad were still too steady. Taking a deep breath, Char closed his eyes and let go of the distracting thoughts in his mind. When he opened his eyes again, his eyes had regained his calmness. At the same time, Charles tried his best to use a gentle tone. "It seems that it is not that our information is wrong, but that you are hiding too deeply. Who would have thought that a child would have such a mature mind, and if you guessed correctly, you should have summoned these 2 people." Hearing this, Richard raised his brows slightly, and couldn't help but glance at Chalgao. Being able to see through it at a glance, the claw shadow was summoned by himself, which shows the high quality of Char. And for this, Richard didn't have any intention to hide it, and immediately nodded to admit it. Seeing this, Child's eyes lit up, and he said again, "I admit that you are very strong in summoning these 2 people, but we still have 4 people and 4 guns, and you only have 2 people. Even if they are strong, we need time, and during this time, I believe it is enough for one of us to pull the trigger. When the time comes, everyone will end up with a dead fish and a broken net, so why bother?" Char is using the same language to ease the current situation and take the initiative again. And listening to Char's words, Richard's face became strange. The mouth cannon skill has always been his common move, but now someone has used it on himself, which makes Richard quite novel. Richard nodded and said with a smile, "What you said makes sense, but you guessed a little wrong. Who told you that I can only summon 2 people?" After the words fell, a famous claw shadow suddenly walked out of the darkness, and in a blink of an eye, the entire room was instantly covered with claw shadows. Char, who was already ready to reverse the situation, saw this scene, and the expression on his face suddenly froze. All the words he had prepared were stuck in his throat. What he just said was completely based on the fact that the strengths of the 2 were relatively equal, but now with the appearance of dozens of claw shadows, Char was not only slapped in the face on the spot, but his remarks just now were completely overturned. A wry smile suddenly appeared on Char's face, and now Char threw the firearm in his hand on the ground, completely giving up resistance. At this point in the matter, he knew very well that he had lost, and he had lost a crushing defeat. The biggest mistake he made was that Richard should not have been chosen as a target. Of course, this is just what he thinks in his heart. If Richard knew, he would definitely pat him on the shoulder and tell him that the worst thing you did was to go against me. Although Char put down his gun, his teammates don't think so. Hydra has never lacked the courage to break the net, whether it is the past, the present, or the future. Therefore, at the moment when Char put down the gun, the three teammates next to him showed a decisive look on their faces, and instantly pulled the trigger in their hands. Bang bang bang. 3 gunshots rang out one after another. Richard sat on the spot without moving, and in front of him, a giant shadow like a mountain of meat suddenly appeared in front of him, blocking 3 bullets. At the same time, behind the 3 Hydra members, 3 claw shadows attacked. The claws penetrated their chests, and the 3 fresh, fiery hearts thumped directly in the hands of the claws. Seeing this scene, Richard did not change his face, while Char, who was beside him, couldn't help showing a trace of sadness on his face. Not for the 3 of them, but for himself. At this moment, as Richard's thoughts moved, all the shadow core present merged into the ground one after another. Richard slowly stood up from the sofa, with a gentlemanly smile on his lips, and walked towards Charles step by step. Finally, after arriving in front of Char, Richard's footsteps slowly stood still, and his indifferent tone also sounded at this moment. Want to live? Richard's voice was not loud, and even if he stood a little farther, he couldn't hear what Richard was saying, but Char still caught the sentence immediately. Katakana middle dot 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 katakana middle dot. He originally had a trace of sadness on his face, but without any hesitation, he knelt down directly in front of Richard. Originally, he was a lot taller than Richard, but as his knees bent, he was immediately shorter than Richard. Seeing this, a satisfied smile appeared on Richard's face. Richard has always been tolerant of talents. Although Charles is not an extraordinary person, his decisiveness and awareness of current affairs made Richard a little impressed. So Richard didn't mind giving him a chance. As for the identity of Char's Hydra, Richard is not worried about this. If he was really loyal to Hydra, he should have just asked for death just like those guys. 0, 0. And since he chose to put down the gun, it means that he still wants to live, and his loyalty to Hydra is naturally not much higher. Follow me, I'll take you to a place. With an order in his mouth, Richard raised his legs and walked outside. Seeing this, Char didn't say a word, got up and followed quickly, maintaining a respectful attitude all the way, and he couldn't see that just a minute ago, he and Richard were still hostile. Leaving the villa, Char took the initiative to open the car door, and Richard sat in. After closing the door, Charles quickly got into the driver's seat, and Richard, who was sitting in the back seat, also reported a place name. Immediately after Char started the car immediately drove away from the villa area and quickly headed towards the Bronx area. When the car stopped under a building in the Bronx, Charlie's eyes suddenly flashed a hint of curiosity, not knowing where Richard brought him. Although curious, Char did not forget his current identity, so he did not dare to ask questions. Seeing this, Richard let out a chuckle and said, "This is the laboratory you've worked so hard to find." As soon as these words came out, Char's footsteps suddenly stopped, and a look of shock appeared on his face. He opened his mouth to say something, but he couldn't say a word. In order to find the laboratory where the super serum and the human body enhancer were stored, they did all kinds of calculations, and finally even put themselves in it, but they didn't get any news. But now Richard took him to the laboratory so openly. For a while, no matter how calm Char's mind was, he could not help but feel a little lost at this moment. However, in just a short moment, Char recovered, his head was slightly lowered, and he put on a respectful gesture. Now his whole life is in Richard's hands, so what if he finds the laboratory? Is it possible that he can still fight for his life and find a way to pass the news? If he could really do this, he wouldn't be standing here alive now. So now that he has chosen to rely on Richard, he will naturally know what to do and what not to do. This is a smart person, who can always put himself in the right position. Although this kind of person has a lot of thoughts, it is also very easy to use. Taking Char into the building, Richard pressed the elevator to the 10th floor. 3 days ago, Bitkobo came to the news that the side effects of human boosters have been successfully improved, but human experiments have not been carried out, so Richard needs to help find an experimental body. It's just that Richard didn't have any good experimental subjects at the time, so this matter was put on hold for the time being. And the reason why he brought Charles directly to the laboratory was that he wanted Charles to act as an experimental body. Many people think that the experimental body in the laboratory can be just found. After all, 3-legged toads are hard to find, and 2-legged people are all over the street. But as everyone knows, the prerequisite for becoming an experimental subject must be one's own person. Otherwise, it took hundreds of millions, billions, to create the serum, and give it to an irrelevant person. If it fails, it's okay to say, but if it succeeds, how will the account be calculated? So for the experimental subject, Richard has always been hesitant about who to choose. It stands to reason that Daniel should be the most suitable candidate. Not only has he been with Richard for a long time, but he is also known to advance and retreat. He is a good seed worth cultivating. But when he learned from Bit's mouth that this experiment had the risk of death, Richard instantly ruled out Daniel. Even if people keep a cat and a dog, they will have feelings for a long time, not to mention that Daniel has been fighting for Richard for such a long time. It is naturally impossible for him to be involved in an experiment like this kind of gambling. After excluding Daniel, Richard originally planned to let Jinhee randomly select someone to come over, but a series of things happened later, which finally dragged on to the present. In the villa, Richard's performance made Richard a little impressed, so he chose to bring him under his command, so that Richard's subordinates had one more person of his own. As a result, the identity of the experimental body will naturally fall on Char. Of course, Richard can also use strangers to do experiments without thinking so much. There are as many people as Jinbian's forces. This is also the choice of most laboratories when conducting human experiments. At that time, if the experiment is successful, just kill the experimental body directly, but it will only take a lot of effort. For Richard, it was a last resort. It's not that Richard is so merciful, it's just that there is a suitable person now, so why not do it? As for whether Char's experiment will be obedient or not, Richard still has this confidence. As the elevator door slowly opened, even though it was late at night, the laboratory was still brightly lit. The scientific research items in the hands of a large number of researchers who are tirelessly researching. Seeing that these people were enthusiastic about their work, Richard nodded with satisfaction. Without disturbing them, the two of Richard walked directly to Bit's office. As for Charles, he seemed to have turned into a wooden man after entering the laboratory, and he would go wherever Richard went. Pushing open the door of the office and walking in, Richard immediately saw Bit, who was leaning on the office chair and looking at a colored newspaper. After hearing the movement, Bit couldn't help but put down the newspaper and glanced at the door. When Richard's figure came into his sight, Bit was startled instantly. He hurriedly got up from the office chair, threw the colored newspaper aside, and stepped forward with a smile on his face. "Road. Why are you here, boss? You didn't tell me when you came, I'll go pick you up." Hearing this, Richard hummed softly, "Give me one less set, I don't like those bells and whistles. I brought you the experimental body you asked for, and ordered the people below to prepare to start, and I'll be here waiting for news." Listening to Richard's instructions, Bit naturally did not dare to be slighted, nodded quickly, and then said with a smile, "Then I will go out and let them prepare, boss, wait a moment." Hearing this, Richard nodded, and then watched Bit leave the office. After Bit left, Richard's eyes fell on Char. "You must have heard it just now. I need you to act as an experimental subject and do an experiment for me. The experiment is very risky and may even lead to death. So, I can give you another chance to choose. As long as you don't want to, I will send someone to send you away immediately." Hearing this, Char still had a dull expression on his face, without any intention to go back on it. "Mr. Richard is serious. Since it is the task you ordered, I will cooperate to complete it. As for the risk of the experiment, as long as it is not 100%, I have no problem." Seeing Char's resolute appearance, Richard nodded with a smile and stopped talking. And Char was suddenly relieved, and now he was finally convinced that his life was saved. In fact, Charles is extremely resistant to this experiment. After all, no one knows what will happen in the process of the experiment, and it is even very likely that he will die inexplicably. But he knew that he didn't have much choice. Don't look at Richard's talkative appearance just now, but Char was sure that as long as he refused, the so-called sending him away was definitely not as simple as leaving the laboratory. Therefore, no matter how reluctant he is in his heart, Char must stand on his head and prove his worth, so that he can survive. As the two ended their conversation, the office suddenly fell into silence, and it wasn't until after a while that Bit came in and said, "Boss is all ready. Normal heartbeat, normal blood pressure, nerves do not respond abnormally. The booster injection was successful, and no adverse reactions have occurred for the time being." More than a dozen scientific researchers were busy in front of a pile of instruments. From time to time, various professional terms popped up in their mouths, and Richard was at a loss. But Richard didn't care either. He just looked at Char, who was in the experimental cabin, with his hands in his arms, and his eyes were full of anticipation. The human body enhancer was originally developed by Norman Osborn, and it has created such a powerful villain as the Green Goblin. The effect can be described as extremely amazing. However, due to the second personality after use, the human body enhancer has not been put into use. After such a long period of improvement and research and development, Bit led his scientific research team, at the cost of reducing the success rate of the human body enhancer, and finally produced such a dangerous human body enhancer. According to Bit, the current human body enhancer has a success rate of 426% and a failure rate of 55%. In other words, whether you can strengthen your success or not is to gamble on luck. If you win the gamble, everyone will be happy. If you lose the gamble, you will pay the price of your life. In this regard, Richard naturally does not care. Anyway, this thing will not be used on him. As for others, since they want to gain great power, how can they not take risks? So whether they succeed or fail, Richard is very indifferent. As time passed, Char's various physical data began to climb wildly. He was wearing only a pair of shorts in the experimental cabin, and his face gradually became hideous, and there was a faint roar coming out. However, due to the isolation of the experimental cabin, it was not very real. It looked more like Charles performing a pantomime, but it was performing with life. 20 minutes passed silently, and the atmosphere in the laboratory became more and more quiet. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the frantically beating data on the instrument. They held their breath and clenched their fists involuntarily. It seemed that these researchers were more nervous than the experimenter, Char. Dong dong dong. Suddenly, a strong heartbeat came from the experimental cabin. Char, who had a grim face before, gradually calmed down at this moment. And his body shape has also undergone extremely strong changes. His body has distinct muscles, and he does not seem to have the exaggerated muscles of those fitness experts. However, compared to the muscles that grow from eating protein powder, every part of Char's body is different. An inch of muscle is stronger and more explosive than those fitness experts. At the same time, a burst of cheers also came from the mouths of many researchers. Success. Great, finally succeeded. Quick, record all the experimental data, don't let any data go. While everyone cheered, Bit beckoned everyone to record all the data. A success doesn't mean anything, but it can provide them with data reference. Richard looked at the excited people and didn't say anything to disturb them. This moment was their moment of glory, and Richard naturally wouldn't spoil the scenery at this moment. See, with a light sound, the hatch of the experimental cabin was opened, and Char, who had been completely reborn, walked out of it step by step. Feeling the powerful power surging in the body, Char's whole person feels extraordinarily wonderful. During the experiment just now, he almost collapsed several times, and he did not know how to spin a few times on the edge of death, but fortunately, he finally survived and gained powerful strength. Ignoring the surrounding researchers who wanted to check his body, Char's eyes quickly locked on Richard, who was standing outside the crowd. He narrowed his eyes slightly, and a dangerous light flashed in his eyes. When people have power and when they don't have power, they have completely two mentalities. This feeling is as if the poor are getting rich. When you have money, you can buy anything, and you can use money to solve everything. Charles has such a mentality at the moment. He has already gained a strong power. Why should he listen to Richard's words obediently? Given that they were enemies an hour ago, it's no surprise that Charles has rebellion. As for all this, Richard seemed undecided. He just put his hands on his chest and looked at him with a smile. At the same time, at the door of the laboratory, a short and fat figure walked in. Step by step towards Richard, Char's mentality is constantly changing. The surrounding researchers also clearly noticed that the atmosphere was not right, and they all dispersed, watching this scene quietly. In front of Richard, Charles, with his height, looked down at Richard with a smile, and said with a smile, "I can become like this. I really want to thank you. In order to express my gratitude, I will send you a gift. Travel to death." When the words fell, Charles no longer concealed it. His eyes were fierce, and he threw his fist at Richard's head. The strong wind whistled, and there was a hint of excitement in Char's eyes. It turned out to be the feeling of dominating a person's life. I thought silently in my heart that Char's fist was about to land on Richard's body, and Richard seemed to be frightened, still standing quietly without making any defensive gestures. But just when Char's self-confidence is the most inflated, even the whole person is floating above the clouds. The 4 mechanical tentacles, which came first in an instant, not only blocked Char's attack, but also overturned Char's whole body. Boom! With a loud roar, Char was stunned for a moment. He only felt an unparalleled force acting on his body instantly. The powerful force he was proud of, in this terrifying force. In the face of power, it completely lost its effectiveness. In the end, his whole body smashed to the ground, and at the same time, 4 mechanical tentacles fixed his limbs, making him unable to move at all. Shocked, puzzled, unbelievable, all kinds of emotions appeared on his face one by one, and at this time, accompanied by a crisp footstep, Richard's figure came into his sight. Looking down at Char, who had been completely immobilized, Richard shook his head jokingly. "You are so disappointing to me that you want to do it so impatiently. I thought you could endure for a few more days." Hearing these words, Char's heart suddenly burst, and the strong confidence that had just risen in his heart, with this change in Richard's words, was like being poured down by a basin of cold water and completely extinguished. He opened his mouth, trying to justify himself, but unfortunately Richard turned around and walked outside without giving him a chance to speak. But before leaving, Richard still gave an order to Dr. Octopus beside him. "He's yours now, remember not to play dead, it's still useful for me to keep him." Richard never thinks that he has a domineering spirit, and people can be convinced at first sight, bow down, and he will never be naive enough to think that if Char takes refuge in himself, he will really become a man. Wholehearted. Therefore, Richard had expected Charles's backlash, so after he entered the experimental cabin, Richard ordered someone to call Dr. Octopus. And things didn't turn out as Richard expected. After gaining a strong power, Charles directly attacked Richard, but he didn't expect that Richard was superior in chess, which eventually led to him being waited by for a long time. Dr. Octopus took it directly. As for why he handed Char to Dr. Octopus, Richard also had his own considerations. First, Dr. Octopus has been trying to improve the 4 mechanical tentacles and want to completely integrate it with the human body, but there is a lack of experimental subjects. People with average physical fitness simply cannot afford such a transformation. The same is true for people who have been injected with super serum, which is far from meeting the requirements of transformation. But Char, who was injected with the human body enhancer, was different. Although the human body enhancer has been improved, the side effects of the second personality have been removed, and the danger has been greatly increased, but the power he can improve remains the same. So Char's strength is comparable to that of the Green Goblin, far stronger than the person who was injected with the super serum. Just enough to meet the experimental requirements of Dr. Octopus. Second, if you want to tame someone like Char, you have to be patient, just like boiling an eagle. Richard also intends to rely on him to break into the Hydra, so naturally he will not give up easily. When I walked out of the laboratory building, it was already 3 o'clock in the morning. As an international metropolis, even at this time, New York City was still brightly lit. Looking around and looking for the direction of home, Richard did not use any ability, just wandered in the direction of home like shopping. In the last life, Richard's favorite thing was to walk on empty streets at night. At that time, there was no hustle and bustle in the daytime, and there was no heavy traffic during the day, only openness and tranquility. Such an environment made Richard extraordinarily relaxed. Since he came to this world, he has not experienced that feeling for a long time, so now he has a chance, he naturally doesn't mind reliving his memories. And just as Richard was walking home, on the other side, Bullseye had completely defeated the forces of Hell's Kitchen. If you can still lose in this situation, then Bullseye can punish himself and apologize. All the horses dispatched by Hell's Kitchen tonight were swept away by Bullseye's men. Even Taylor and Wilson were captured by Bullseye's men and brought to Bullseye. On the street, there was a crowd of black people all around. Bullseye was in the center of the crowd, and in front of him, Taylor and Wilson knelt on their knees. At this moment, the faces of the two were full of numbness, and their eyes seemed a little empty. They came in a hurry, but they fell into the enemy's trap. Not only the elite of their men were lost, but even they themselves fell into the hands of the enemy. And most importantly, from today onwards, Hell's Kitchen is really gone. Under such a heavy blow, the two did not commit suicide on the spot, and they were already greedy for life and fear of death, so numbness was the only emotion they could show now. Looking at the appearance of the two, Bullseye sneered disdainfully, and didn't even bother to say a word to them. After all, Bullseye has never looked at them, and naturally there is no interest in humiliating them. At the moment, Bullseye waved his hand, then turned around and left. Before he could take a few steps, there was a gunshot behind him. In this regard, Bullseye owes even the will to look back. After leaving the street, Bullseye put away the expression on his face, and the whole person became calm again. Are those three little mice staring at it? Quote. When the words fell, a strong man who had been following Bullseye immediately nodded. Our people are already staring, they can't run away, don't worry, Mr. Lester. Listening to the assurances made by his subordinates, Bullseye nodded with satisfaction, but said again, you stay here, finish everything, and let them report the whereabouts of the three little mice directly to me. I'm going to meet them in person. After finishing speaking, there was a flash of excitement in Bullseye's eyes, which was the desire to fight and the excitement of killing. As for Bullseye's order, the strong man beside him naturally couldn't have any opinion. He nodded respectfully, answered yes, and then handed a headset to Bullseye. Bullseye took it over and jumped directly into a muscle car. With the bang of the accelerator, a violent noise spread throughout the street, and the muscle car roared like a beast and rushed into the distance. This time, in order to catch all the people in Hell's Kitchen, Bullseye has set up a net. This net is all over New York City. Unless someone can leave New City overnight, it is impossible to escape the surveillance of this huge net. Of course, only Jin Bing and Star Stripe Federation can use such a method, and even S.H.I.E.L.D. has no ability to set up such a net. Because there are too many related aspects, although S.H.I.E.L.D. is powerful, it does not have such a deep relationship. And Jin Bing is in control of the 3 religions and 9 streams, and even the homeless on the street may be his eyeliner. So this is why Jin and why he can control the entire underground world of New York City. Of course, this method can only be used as an unconventional method. It can be used for a while but cannot be used for a lifetime. After all, no one can monitor the people around them at any time, unless they are training elite agents. After escaping from Wall Street, Matthew, Vickers, and Frank Lees did not dare to stop at all, and quickly evacuated to the sparsely populated place. Matthew and Frank have been fighting against Jin Bing for a long time, and it is very clear that the more crowds, the more Jin Bing's eyeliner, so if you want to get rid of Jin Bing's subordinates, you must get rid of Jin Bing's eyeliner. Otherwise, once Jin Bing's forces gather, no matter how strong they are, they can beat 10 or 100, and it is impossible to beat 1,000 or 10,000, not to mention that these people still have guns. As for Vickers, he naturally obeyed them both unconditionally. Therefore, the escape route of the group of 3 people was quite smooth, and they tried to walk in alleys or remote areas along the way to reduce contact with the crowd. As for the direction of their escape, it happened to be the direction of the Bronx district, because there were a lot of parks built here, which were extremely suitable for hiding. Prospect Avenue, an urban construction road in the Bronx district, bright street lamps illuminate the entire avenue, and both sides are largely empty. It is far away from the commercial and residential areas and is one of the main roads leading to the Bronx. At this time, in the wilderness on the left side of the avenue, the three of Vickers were moving fast along the Cross Avenue. The speed of the three of them was extremely fast, reaching the speed of a normal person sprinting. This is nothing to Matthew and Frank. Given their physical fitness, this speed is just right. But there is still a fuel bottle like Vickers. He has already been out of breath when fleeing all the way. At this moment, the rapid breathing sound is like an old bellows, whirring. Hey, stop, I think we've run far enough, can we take a break, I really can't run anymore. Vickers stopped slowly and greeted Matthew and Frank. In the face of Vickers' request, Frank refused without hesitation. I can feel the danger, it has not dissipated, and there are still people following us, so we can't stop. Hearing this, Vickers' expression changed suddenly, and he subconsciously wanted to continue to take steps, but his physical exhaustion made his legs feel as if they were filled with lead, unable to move another steps. Immediately, Vickers sat down on the ground, lying flat in the wilderness, breathing heavily, and said weakly, "Shit, I'm out of strength, let that crisis feel like hell, I can't run anymore." Hearing this, Matthew and Frank, who had slowed down in front of Vickers, couldn't help but stop, and a hint of helplessness flashed on Matthew's face. With their temperament, they would not have brought a tow oil bottle like Vickers, and they were afraid of the current situation. But Vickers and Matthew, who have known each other since childhood, asked Matthew to abandon Vickers. Even if Matthew behaved informally, he could not abandon his friends. As for Frank, although he didn't mind leaving Vickers, he didn't want to keep Matthew. It's not how deep the relationship between the two of them is. It's just that in the current situation, one more person is more powerful. Although one person is easy, it also lacks helpers. So in the case of one pit and two gods, even a superhero can't change the current situation. The speed of the three of them could only stop temporarily, allowing Vickers to take a breath. But didn't give them too long to relax. Just a few minutes after they stopped, there was a sudden roar of cars on the road next to them. The sound spread from far to near, and soon spread throughout the entire avenue, and it was difficult for them to hear it even if they wanted to. Vickers, who was originally half dead, immediately sat up from the spot when he heard the sound of the car. His face was full of tension, and his tone was a little panic. "Come on." After speaking, Vickers turned to look at Matthew and Frank, and saw that both of them had the same solemn expression, but the steps under their feet remained motionless. Immediately Vickers became anxious. "Come on, what are you doing standing there?" Hearing this, Frank shook his head and said calmly, "Where do you think we can go in this place?" Vickers was stunned for a moment, and he glanced around in a dazed way. Then he realized that they were in a wilderness, and there were not even taller trees around, and the person who came was obviously driving a car. Don't talk about running at this time, there is nowhere to hide. For a while, Vickers could only shrink slightly, standing behind Matthew for 2 years to minimize his presence. Soon, the roaring car stopped on the road not far from them. It's a muscle car that's full of power at a glance. When Bullseye opened the car door and got out of the car, Frank's eyes narrowed, and a dangerous light appeared in his eyes. And Matthew's ears moved slightly at this moment, listening to the familiar footsteps, and instantly recognized the identity of the person who came. At the same time, Bullseye, who got out of the car on the other side, looked at the three Matthews who were in the wild with vigilant faces, and a dangerous smile appeared on their faces, and said enthusiastically, "Long time no see, I can't think of today. It is rare to meet on such an occasion." As he spoke, Bullseye approached the two, and his words did not reveal the slightest aggression, as if what he saw was not an enemy but two old friends. But as an old opponent of Bullseye, neither Matthew nor Frank would be fooled by the appearance of Bullseye. They know very well what a ruthless heart is hidden under this enthusiastic appearance. As for Vickers, he had been ignored by Bullseye at the moment, and Vickers would naturally not be so stupid that he jumped out on his own. For him, the more Bullseye ignored him, the happier he was. And just after Bullseye finished speaking, Matthew, who had been silent for a long time, said, "I didn't expect to see you in such a place. Last time I let you get away with it, this time you dare to come alone. It seems that the trouble with the two of us is not enough for you. As the saying goes, the loser does not lose the battle, whether it is a decent or a villain." Even at this moment, Matthew's tone is still not weak, as strong as ever. And Matthew's words also reminded Bullseye of some bad memories. At the moment, Bullseye couldn't help but reached out and touched his bald head. His eyes turned cold. I really can't beat the two of you alone, but I am entangled with you. Enough. After a while, my people will arrive, and then I will see where you are fleeing. After speaking, Bullseye immediately made an attacking stance, looking ready to strike at any time. When Matthew and Frank saw this, they immediately took a stance. For a time, the surrounding air seemed to be quiet, the wind was no longer blowing, the clouds were not moving, and only 3 strands of chi were slowly rising from the body of the 3 of them. And just as the 3 faced off, a crisp footstep sounded from the other side of the avenue. The footsteps echoed under the night, filling the quiet night sky, so it seemed a bit melodious. And at this moment, any slight movement is enough to attract attention. Therefore, including Vickers, the 4 turned to look at the same time. On the other side of the avenue, the figure of a child suddenly came into their eyes. Seeing this scene, several people's faces could not help but flash, stunned. After all, whose child does not sleep most of the night, wandering on the highway? And just when a few people were in a daze, Richard, who was not far from them, was also stunned, and the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. What kind of luck is this? You can still see people fighting in a place like this. Richard looked at the few people on the field with a curious look in his eyes. At this moment, he has seen the situation on the field clearly, and he has also seen Bullseye, and has recognized his identity. It's not that Richard is so familiar with Bullseye, but the circular pattern on his bright forehead makes it difficult for people to recognize his identity. Also, when Richard recognized Bullseye, Bullseye also recognized Richard. As the #1 assassin under Jin Bing, he must be familiar with his boss's family, otherwise, it would be embarrassing if he picks the wrong assassination target. Therefore, the moment Richard appeared, Bullseye recognized his identity and secretly said in his heart, "No, why is he here?" Since he just returned from the mission, Bullseye does not know the details of Richard, and at this juncture, Richard's appearance can be said to disrupt all of Bullseye's plans. He didn't know why Richard was in this place at this point in time, but he knew that if Richard had the slightest damage, Kim would definitely skin him. For a time, he was calm and relaxed, but a sense of urgency suddenly appeared in his heart. And he can't let the opposite Matthew and Frank see it, otherwise once you let them know Richard's identity, Bullseye will not be sure to protect Richard under the siege of the 2. As for whether the 2 would do such a thing, Bullseye did not know, he only knew that if he were in the position of the 2, he would definitely hijack Richard without hesitation. Pushing others by themselves, Bullseye believes they will make the same choices as themselves. Looking at Richard who was still approaching, Bullseye suddenly smiled cruelly. "Where is the child? I heard that the sound of a child's neck being twisted is the most beautiful sound in the world. I don't know if it is true or not." As he spoke, there was a look of excitement on Bullseye's face, as if he really intended to break Richard's neck. Hearing this, the expressions of Matthew and Frank suddenly changed. Originally, they were still thinking about why there was a child, but at this moment they gave up thinking about this problem in an instant. As Bullseye's opponents, they know very well that Bullseye always enjoys killing people. Since he can say it, he can do it. Therefore, the 2 blocked Bullseye's path for the first time, and said quickly, "Get out of here and go home." If it was an adult who appeared at the moment, the reaction of the 2 might not be so big, and as long as they were more careful, they would find that although Bullseye said it cruelly, its posture was more to guard against the 2 of them. People. But there is no if in the world. Richard's identity as a child instantly won the sympathy of Matthew and the 2 of them. Coupled with Bullseye's remarks, they didn't have time to think too much, so they made what they thought was the right decision. Blocked in front of Richard and blocked Bullseye's way. Richard, who had a panoramic view of all this, instantly saw through the thoughts of these 2 groups of people, and Richard didn't know whether to cry or laugh at the moment. For a while, a playful smile appeared on his face. At the same time, dark shadows quickly gathered behind Richard. In the blink of an eye, dozens of claw shadows appeared directly behind Richard, lining up in a line, exuding a dark aura. Matthew and Frank, who had their backs to Richard, didn't notice it, but Bullseye, who was standing opposite them, and Vickers, who was hiding, saw this scene clearly. For a time, the pupils of Bullseye's eyes could not help shrinking slightly, and Vickers directly widened his eyes and opened his mouth slightly. He wanted to say something, but it seemed as if something blocked his throat. Only a whimper sounded. The changes in the expressions of the two were also instantly captured by Matthew and Frank. Suddenly, the two suddenly turned around and looked behind them. Because Matthew lost his eyesight, he couldn't see the situation behind him at all, and the sombre core had not yet moved, so his senses, which he had always been proud of, temporarily lost their effectiveness in front of the sombre core. Nang frowned and asked, "What's wrong?" Hearing this, Frank, whose face had become extremely ugly, said with a hint of anger in his tone, "We have been tricked, this child is from Jin Bing." As soon as these words came out, Matthew's expression changed slightly. Although it was not as obvious as Frank's expression, it still made people feel the anger in him. Mistaking the opponent for an ordinary person is definitely a shame for them, so they naturally have reason to be angry. Looking at the changes in the expressions of the two, Richard also waved his hand at this moment, and the claw shadow that was standing behind Richard suddenly turned into a black shadow and disappeared in place. Katakana middle dot 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 katakana middle dot. A strong wind was stirred up with Claw Shadow's action. The two of Matthew didn't expect Richard to do it, and their faces couldn't help showing a look of surprise. However, the long-standing combat response made the two of them make the most appropriate choice for the first time. The speed of the Claw Shadow is extremely fast, and under the cover of the night, it is even more silent if it turns into a ghost. Therefore, neither of them dared to be careless and chose back to back for the first time, so that no matter which direction the Claw Shadows attacked, they would have time to react. The sharp claws cut through the air, and there was a squeaking sound in an instant. Matthew held the blind man's stick in his hand and quickly swung it out. A slender blind man's stick seemed to have the power to turn corruption into magic in his hand, repeatedly blocked the attack of the Claw Shadow. Similarly, Frank's performance was not bad at all. He pulled out two sharp daggers directly from his legs, and the two daggers were played with flowers in his hands. The silver-white edge shone constantly in the moonlight, and the hands were swung again and again. The dagger collided with the claws of the claw eye, and there was a sound of metal clashing. For a while, the two of them joined forces, and dozens of Claw Shadows couldn't help them. Richard, who was watching this scene, saw this, but there were no waves in his eyes, all he had was calmness. Richard didn't know the identities of the two at first, but when he saw Bullseye, he had already guessed 7 or 8. After all, Jin Bing has many dead enemies, but there are only a few that Bullseye can deal with in person. In addition, the dresses on the two of them are so obvious, so guessing their identities is completely logical. It is precisely because of this that Richard is even less worried about this battle. Although Daredevil and Punisher are very powerful in the movie, they cannot change the fact that they are only mortals. Although the fighting skills are superb, once there is no physical support, the excellent fighting skills are nothing but paper tigers, so the outcome of the battle is doomed from the moment Richard appeared. Just as Matthew and Frank were under siege, Bullseye not far away finally recovered from his daze. He could never have imagined that Richard, who he thought was troublesome, summoned a group of men in black with a wave of his hand, and surrounded Matthew and Frank, who he was not sure he would stay behind. This kind of feeling is like, you always thought you were a child of a poor family, but one day your father suddenly told you that the family has billions of wealth, and you are a rich second generation. It is the so-called great joy and great sadness of life. Turning his head and taking a look, Vickers, who was beside him with a shocked expression, flashed Bullseye's figure. Before Vickers could react, he knocked him unconscious with a hand knife. After doing all this, Bullseye bypassed the battlefield and came to Richard's side. When he came to see Richard's figure, 6'8", he clearly looked like a child, but Bullseye seemed to see a demon king standing there, and his heart suddenly froze, and he was about to ask the question. Doubt turned into a greeting instantly after speaking. "Mr. Richard." Hearing this, Richard turned his head and glanced at Bullseye, and nodded as a response. His attitude was neither enthusiastic nor indifferent, but it gave Bullseye a flattered feeling. It was as if it was such an honor to be able to get a glimpse of Richard. This feeling is inexplicable, but it is indeed Bullseye's real feeling. For a time, Bullseye's heart was full of horror, and his face became more and more respectful. After so many things, Richard is no longer the Richard who was still a little cautious. Although the appearance looks unchanged, but the heart has completely matured, quite the style of the king. If he used to rely on some small tricks to convince Daniel, now that he, even just standing here, is enough to make Bullseye bow his head. It can be seen that Richard's temperament has changed rapidly in this period of time. As soon as the screen changed, the eyes fell on the battlefield again, and at this time, Matthew and Frank showed a trace of fatigue on their faces. They can have today's strength, and they are all trained by themselves little by little. There is no so-called extraordinary technology, and there is no strange change. Therefore, even if their strength far exceeds that of ordinary people, they will not be able to last for long in the face of opponents like Claw Shadow. Not to mention the single strength of the Claw Shadow, although it is powerful, if it is one-on-one, it will definitely be killed in seconds. But the most powerful force of the Sombre Corps has always been not the individual strength, but the quantity and cooperation. Dozens of Claw Shadows, in groups of 3, took turns to launch the offensive. Due to their close cooperation with each other, their offensives continued, like waves, one after another. And every time they would cause some minor injuries to the two of Matthew, such as a wound, and for example, through collision, their arms would go numb. These subtle effects seemed inconspicuous at first, but when they formed a wave-like offensive, this little effect was gradually accumulated. Just like a famous saying, the embankment of 1,000 miles collapsed in the ant's nest, and the situation of the two of them is similar to the situation described in this sentence. Therefore, in less than 10 minutes, after adding dozens of scars to the bodies of Matthew and the two, they finally collapsed. Looking at the two people who fell to the ground, Bullseye's eyes lit up instantly, and he immediately stood up and volunteered, "Mr. Richard, I will abolish their limbs and make sure that they completely lose their resistance." After speaking, Bullseye planned to step forward, but before he could take the first step, Richard raised his hand to stop him, and said indifferently, "Don't be so troublesome, just kill it." When the words fell, Bullseye's face was startled, but before he could say anything, the claw shadow around the two of Matthew had already started. The sharp claws passed directly through the chests of the two of Matthew, and at the same time, the hearts of the two of them were also picked out by the shadow of the claws. For a while, a large hole appeared on the chests of the two of them, and blood was flowing out of their chests like water. As for the faces of the two, they were already full of unbelievable expressions at the moment. Maybe they never thought that they would die. And died so neatly. Therefore, until the second before death came, they still hadn't reacted. Bullseye also looked at this scene, and his face also showed a moment of loss. He has fought with these two people for an unknown number of times, and they have both won and lost each other. Now, when he sees these two people die in front of him with his own eyes, there is a feeling of emptiness in Bullseye's heart. Of course, this feeling came and went quickly, and soon a touch of excitement filled his cheeks again. Bullseye is still the Bullseye who likes to kill, and it has never changed from beginning to end. The previous loss was nothing but regrets caused by the disappearance of the opponent. As for Richard, there is no special feeling about it. Maybe the two were superheroes in the last life, but unfortunately Richard has only heard their names and has not even seen the movie. So their deaths were less emotional for Richard than Norman Osborn's death. And for these two people, Richard has actually shown mercy, and for nothing else, just blocked in front of him just now because of these two people. Otherwise, the three major arms will be dispatched together, and they will not be able to last for such a long time. This is also a trace of sympathy that arises when Richard is bored, better than nothing. As for why he didn't want to subdue these two people, Richard dismissed this unrealistic idea from the beginning of knowing their identities. The two of them are rare dark heroes in Marvel. Although they are in the dark, their hearts are bright. The determination of such a person is far beyond what a high school teenager like Peter can match. So instead of spending hours on them, it is better to solve it neatly and give the other party a good time. In this way, Richard has spent several interesting hours from school to the present. Originally, he did not intend to participate in this series of things, but he was inexplicably mixed into it. I don't know if it was Richard's luck. No, or bad luck for these guys. It's up to you. Remember to sweep your tail clean, I'll go first. After saying hello to Bullseye, Richard took another step and walked towards the direction of the moon. The moonlight shone on the ground, pulling his figure extraordinarily long. And Bullseye stood behind him, nodded respectfully at his back, then quickly took out his mobile phone and summoned people to clean up the mess. When the first rays of sunlight appeared on the day, Richard was already standing in his room, looking at the rising sun outside the window. A lazy smile appeared on Richard's face. Although he had not slept all night, he did not feel any fatigue. At this moment, Vanessa came from outside the door with a worried voice. "Richard, are you back?" As the voice fell, the door opened in response. Vanessa pushed the door and walked in, and happened to see Richard standing by the bed. Immediately, Vanessa breathed a sigh of relief, and then a trace of resentment appeared on her face. "Richard, did your father send you back? Why didn't I see anyone else?" "He really is. You are still so young, it is too much to let you go to him. I must talk about him when I come back." Hearing this, Richard's eyes blinked, and he instantly got a lot of information from Vanessa's words. "I didn't return last night, so it must be Jin Bing who helped me to cover," and immediately responded with a smile. "Nisha, you're right, my father is too much, and I didn't sleep well. You must teach me a lesson." After speaking, Richard also waved his small fist vigorously, showing a look of righteous indignation, and accused Vanessa of the sin of the gold merger. This diverts Vanessa's attention from the question of who sent Richard back. And Jin Bing, who hasn't returned home, doesn't know yet that Richard dug a hole for him as soon as he got home. After washing up and having breakfast prepared by Vanessa, Richard walked out of the house with his school bag on his back. At the door, Daniel's car was already waiting here. When he saw Richard go out, Daniel quickly got out of the car, pulled out the back seat, and let Richard sit in directly. Sitting on the back seat, Richard looked at Daniel, who was several times more vigilant than before in the cab, and his eyes quickly fell on his severed finger. But with just a flat glance, Richard looked back without expressing any doubts about the matter. If Daniel didn't show up in time yesterday, he was dereliction of duty. If he made a mistake, he would naturally end up making a mistake. This is the rule. Richard is not going to change anything and doesn't want to change anything. This may sound a bit cruel, but it is the so-called no rules and no circles, so Richard did not show any sympathy or other emotions. Of course, Richard wouldn't deny a person just because of a dereliction of duty, so his attitude remained as usual. It was this same attitude as usual that made Daniel completely relieved. Before that, his heart had been hanging high, for fear that Richard would be angry because of what happened yesterday, and maybe he didn't even feel that the longer he was with Richard, the more he felt towards Richard, the greater the awe. Even vaguely, even Jin can't compare. And all of this is naturally because Richard is getting more and more used to his current identity, and the momentum brought by his identity and strength is also constantly increasing. Back on campus again, far away from the hustle and bustle of the outside world, there is no conspiracy and tricks, and some only have the crisp laughter of many children. This feeling made Richard quite comfortable, and now he continues to go to school, not only because of his age, but also because the atmosphere here can make Richard's heart quiet. Richard returned to his normal life, and the week slipped by without knowing it. The destruction of Hell's Kitchen, the failure of the Hydra plan, the disappearance of Daredevil and the Punisher, this series of events did not even cause a wave in New York City. Their disappearance is like being erased from memory. Except for those who are related to them, no one in the outside world has noticed. New York City lost 2 superheroes in one night, and the century-old power of Hell's Kitchen also followed, destruction. And during this time, the fame of the Fantastic Four was still at its peak, and it didn't dilute with the passage of time. In the laboratory of a certain building, Victor stared at the screen in front of him, his face full of calm, but from his clenched hands, it could be seen that his heart was not calm at the moment. Victor wants to compete with the subject for control of consciousness, so he needs power and desires power. And a cosmic storm brought him power that ordinary people can't reach, but it was not enough for him, so he needed the special power of the Fantastic Four. Therefore, he specially developed a device to absorb the special power of the Fantastic Four, which he named the Energy Absorber. At the moment, the research on the Energy Absorber has reached the final step, and until a series of green characters flashed on the screen in front of him, Victor's calm face suddenly showed a hint of joy. In the depths of his eyes, there was a touch of excitement, which made him wave his fist vigorously. Success! With a loud shout of excitement, Victor quickly calmed down, and now he can't wait. So after the successful development of the energy absorber, Victor immediately dialed the contact information that Richard left him. As the call was connected, Daniel's voice came from the other end of the phone. "Hello, who is it?" Hearing the voice of an adult man, Victor was stunned, but he finally said with a hint of doubt, "I'm looking for Your Excellency the Holy Master." When the words fell, a strange color flashed on Daniel's face on the other end of the phone. Richard had previously instructed that if anyone called His Excellency the Holy Master, give him the phone. At the moment, Daniel did not dare to neglect, and quickly said, "Wait a minute." While speaking, Daniel got out of the car and walked into the campus. At this moment, it was closing time on the campus, so Daniel found Richard in the classroom without much effort. Quickly approaching Richard, Daniel put his hands up and handed over the phone, while respectfully saying, "Mr. Richard, the person you ordered has called." Hearing this, Richard reacted instantly, ignoring Monica, who was full of curiosity, picked up the phone and walked out of the classroom directly. Daniel followed behind Richard and quickly emptied the people around Richard, leaving a relatively quiet environment for Richard. "It's me." A familiar voice appeared in his ears, and Victor's originally uneasy heart instantly calmed down, and he quickly said, "Your Excellency, you should have not forgotten what you promised me. My device has been successfully developed, and we can start." Quote. Hearing this, Richard's face suddenly showed a cold arc, and he said indifferently, "I see, someone will find you tomorrow." After speaking, Richard hung up the phone, and at the same time looked up at the sky and said to himself, "Dark Alliance, it's time to be born." Richard formed the Dark Alliance to help himself, not to look good there. Although there are only 3 members of the Dark Alliance, the strength of these 3 is absolutely unquestionable. Even if you look at the entire Marvel world, they all belong to the powerhouses standing at the top of the pyramid. Therefore, the matter of the Fantastic Four can just be handed over to them, and by the way, it can also start the name of the Dark Alliance. After all, the Dark Alliance needs to grow and become famous, and it is impossible to remain unknown. Otherwise, why did Richard form the Dark Alliance? So this time, not only to fulfill Richard's own promise to Victor, but also to announce the existence of the Dark Alliance to the world. After making up his mind, Richard took the phone and dialed 2 numbers in succession, each of which only said a short sentence, "Assemble, your mission is here." After that, Richard hung up the phone directly. After doing all this, Richard did not go back to the classroom, but turned around and walked outside the school. Seeing this, Daniel, who was waiting on the side, did not express any opinion on this, but silently took out a mobile phone from his pocket and sent a message to the principal, asking the principal to approve a leave of absence. It was impossible for the principal to disagree with this, because he was the only person in the whole school who knew Richard's identity. When he arrived at the gate of the campus, Daniel quickly stepped forward to open the car door, and Richard sat in directly. As Daniel got into the driver's seat, he started the car and said respectfully, "Mr. Richard, where are we going?" Hearing this, Richard opened his mouth and reported a place name, New City TV. Hearing this place, Daniel was stunned for a moment. He didn't know why Richard was going to this place. For a while, a hint of doubt flashed on his face. But with Richard by his side for so long, he has long since learned what to ask and what not to ask. Richard would naturally say what he wanted him to know, and shut up and work if he didn't want him to know. Therefore, Daniel quickly came to his senses, started the car neatly, and then went to the New City TV station. In fact, it was Daniel's helpless move to go to the TV station. It wasn't until just now that he suddenly realized a problem. The Dark Alliance didn't even have a headquarters. As a result, the members gathered now, and there was a situation where there was nowhere to go. Neither the Emperor's building nor the laboratory where Dr. Octopus is located are obviously suitable as a gathering place for members of the Dark Alliance. So Richard had no choice but to set the location on New York TV. Of course, there is a more important reason for choosing this place in addition to the above reasons. If the Dark Alliance wants to make a name in one fell swoop, it is naturally impossible to rely on word of mouth. In that case, the speed is too slow, and it does not meet Richard's expectations. So Richard made a bold decision, which is to broadcast the fight between the Fantastic Four and the Fantastic Four on an all-federal live broadcast. At that time, it will definitely attract the attention of countless people, and it will also make the Dark Alliance famous. Although it may cause some trouble, Richard, who is gradually full of wings, is not afraid. However, as a result, Richard must rely on the power of the media. In the entire New York City, the only one that can spread the information of the battle scene to the whole of the Federation at the first time is New York City television. So that's why Richard chose this place. When the car was parked downstairs at the TV station, Daniel was about to get out of the car to open the door for Richard, but before he could act, Richard's words rang in the back seat. "You don't have to follow me. You go back first, and remember not to let anyone see you. By the way, this car should be destroyed after you go back. After sitting for so long, it's time for a new car." Listening to Richard's instructions, Daniel suddenly stopped and silently answered yes. He had a hunch that this time Richard's disturbance would definitely not be small, and it might even be impossible for Jin to settle it, so he was so cautious. In this regard, Daniel not only did not have any fear, but was faintly excited. He is an adventurous person, otherwise he would not join Jin Bing's men, so Daniel is full of expectations for Richard's upcoming big move. The only thing that made him a little helpless was that he couldn't personally participate in such a big event, which really made him regret. After Richard got off the car, Daniel did not stop any longer, and drove away decisively. Richard, on the other hand, stood alone on the street opposite the TV station, with excited eyes flashing in his eyes, looking at the crowded TV station in front of him and saying to himself, "In the era of superheroes, I've waited too long, let me kick it off." While speaking, a tiger-shaped mask slowly emerged from Richard's face, and finally completely covered Richard's face. At the same time, Richard's hands suddenly raised upwards at this moment, and the whole process was full of ritual, as if saying goodbye to the past years. In the next second, the ninja, Claw Shadow, Giant Shadow, and the three major shadow troops emerged from behind Richard, occupying the entire street in an instant. The pedestrians who were walking normally on the street, watching this sudden scene, instantly felt a panic in their hearts, and the next second, a scream sounded all over the street. As for these people, Richard turned a blind eye at this moment, raised his right hand and pointed to the TV station, and hoarse words slowly came out of Richard's mouth. "Diaresis, control this building, from now on, you are not allowed to enter." Quote. After the words fell, the three corps behind Richard nodded respectfully at the same time, and in the next second they jumped up and rushed to the TV station. The personnel entering and leaving the TV station watched such a terrifying scene, and everyone was so frightened that their hands and feet went weak, and some Li Hao Hao even sat on the ground with their buttocks, so the Black Shadow Corps did not encounter any decent resistance at all. And Richard is also moving at this moment, walking towards the TV station step by step. In his small body, he exudes a monstrous power at this moment. Wherever he passes, the crowd retreats, and everyone retreats. And that's Richard's purpose. From this moment on, he will step on the spines of all living beings and ascend to the top of the supreme throne. From this moment on, he will laugh at the situation in the world and overlook the joys and sorrows of the world. From this moment on, his name must be known to all beings, and his words must be heard by all beings. He will represent darkness and accept all the sins of the world. He wants to let the world know that darkness has always existed in this world and has been looking down on them. And he is the master of darkness, Richard Fisk. For the Sombre Corps, Richard's order is their highest order, and they will meticulously implement every word Richard said. Therefore, when Richard came across the street to the gate of the TV station had completely fallen into the control of the Sombre Corps. All the people on each floor were driven to a corner and squatted together, shivering. As Richard stepped in, a black shadow ninja suddenly emerged from the ground and stood in 2 rows on Richard's path. In the next second, they all knelt down on one knee and put their right hand on the left shoulder, up, to show your respect. Naturally, this series of actions wasn't arranged by Richard, and he wasn't that boring yet. These were made by the Black Shadow Corps on their own initiative after feeling Richard's intentions. It was like an ancient enthronement ceremony that always had to follow a ritual. Taking the elevator, Richard quickly came to the top floor of the TV station. The director of the TV station is a fat white man. At this moment, his fat face is covered with cold sweat. The white shirt was completely wet with the sweat on his body, making him look as if he had just been fished out of the water, which can be said to be very embarrassed. Harry didn't know what was wrong with him. Looking at the little figure with the tiger-shaped mask in front of him, Harry could only feel that every nerve in his body was beating wildly. Especially when this figure's eyes fell on him, it made his breathing tighten, and the whole person almost couldn't breathe. With a trembling tone, he took the initiative to open his mouth and said, This gentleman, do you know if there is anything I can help you with?" After finally finishing a sentence, Harry seemed to even exert his strength out, and the whole person almost collapsed. Richard watched this scene. The corners of his mouth were slightly upturned, and the arc was not very large, but it made Harry feel as if he was being stared at by a wild beast, and the whole person was almost fainted by fright. Fortunately, Richard's hoarse voice sounded slowly at this time, causing him to tremble and wake up instantly. "Don't worry, as long as you cooperate obediently, I guarantee you are safe and sound." Hearing this, Harry nodded hurriedly, not knowing if he heard Richard's words clearly, and Richard didn't care, and continued to speak. "I want to broadcast the biggest battle live in the entire New York City, and you are responsible for the perfect broadcast of this battle. I want the entire Federation to see this battle. Can you do it?" Richard narrated in a flat voice, without threatening or doing anything else. But for Harry, as long as he can live, let alone broadcast a battle, even if it is to broadcast a war, he has no problem. Therefore, after Richard finished speaking, Harry immediately patted his chest and assured, "Don't worry, I will definitely complete the task you gave me, and there will be absolutely no mistakes." Hearing this, Richard nodded with satisfaction, and then sat down on the office chair that originally belonged to Harry. Seeing this, Harry nodded with a trembling smile, then bent down and exited the office, and quickly went down to give instructions. As the director of New City TV, Harry still has 2 points of ability. He forced himself not to look at the shadow troops standing in every corner, and Harry quickly explained the task. Immediately, everyone on the TV station endured the fear, got busy. Harry didn't know what scale the so-called battle that Richard said could reach, but for the sake of his own life, he used all the supplies he could. Including 2 aerial photography helicopters, he was also completely mobilized. However, the preparation of these things takes a certain amount of time. Even if everyone works overtime, they will not be ready until tomorrow. And that's why Richard came to the TV a day earlier. Just when the TV station was busy, the phone of the New York City Police Department was about to blow up. After all, there were not 1 or 2 pedestrians who saw the Sombre Corps at that time, so naturally, CGFC, there was no shortage of people to call the police. After receiving so many calls, the New York City Police Department naturally attached great importance to it, and dispatched a large number of police officers to the TV station immediately. But only halfway through the road, suddenly the voice of the New York City Police Commissioner rang in all the police cars. "The TV station doesn't need to go, everyone is withdrawing, I repeat, everyone is withdrawing." Hearing these words, the heavily armed police officers looked at each other in dismay, but faced with the orders of their immediate superiors, they naturally couldn't disobey. Therefore, halfway through the dispatch of the police, the people from the police station retreated. At the same time, at the top of the TV station, Richard also received a call from Jin Bing. Seeing Jin Bing's call, Richard was stunned for a moment, but since his face was covered by a tiger-shaped mask, he couldn't see it at all. With the constant urging of the phone ringing, Richard finally answered the call. When the call was connected, Jin Bing's serious voice came from the other end of the phone for the first time. "I saw your news in the newspaper. I don't know what you want to do, but no matter what you do, let me know next time. I have already solved the troubles outside for you, now let go and do what you want, and don't forget, I am your father." After finishing speaking, Jin indirectly hung up the phone, not giving Richard time to speak at all. And Richard looked at the phone that had fallen into blind tone, and he couldn't help crying and laughing for a while, and at the same time, a warm current developed. This is the first time he has spoken to him in such a serious tone, not because Richard did something wrong, but because Richard did something without telling him first and asking him to help, so he was angry because of it. Originally, Richard didn't want to involve Jin and involved in this matter. After all, once it happened, the impact would be too great, and it might even be hostile to the entire Star Stripe Federation. But now Jin Bian directly forcibly intervenes and participates in this matter, which suddenly makes Richard realize that he does not want Jin Biao to intervene in it, for fear of involving Jin Bian. How could Jin Ning, as a father, have the heart to disregard his son in the face of danger? Therefore, Richard could only silently accept the gold and be kind, and continue to execute his plan. At this moment, at the entrance of the TV station, Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus also came to the TV station. Stepping through the door, looking at the TV station that was completely occupied by the Sombre Corps, a hint of doubt flashed in the eyes of Peter and Dr. Octopus. Because they came early, they didn't hear any news, and they didn't know that Richard had forcibly occupied the TV station, so he showed such an expression. Just when the two looked puzzled, the two black shadow ninjas came to them, made a gesture of please, turned around and led the way, walking towards the front. Seeing this, even though the two of them still had doubts in their hearts, they didn't speak much, let alone exchange anything. Soon, the two of them followed Black Shadow Ninja to the top floor of the TV station. As the door of the office was pushed open, the two walked in directly, and immediately saw Richard wearing a tiger head mask on his face. Seeing this scene, the expressions of the two of them were suddenly shocked, and Richard jumped down. Although the tiger-shaped mask on Richard's face has no green face and fangs, it is born with the power of a king, which makes people dare not look directly at it. For a while, Peter and Dr. Octopus couldn't help lowering their heads at the same time, and said hello in a low voice, "Mr. Richard, boss, here we are." After listening to the greetings from the two of them, Richard nodded as a response, and then a hoarse voice sounded in the ears of the two of them, "I have prepared a big stage for you, and tomorrow is the time for you to perform on the stage. I need you all to show your best form and build the reputation of the Dark Alliance." As soon as these words came out, the doubts in Peter and his heart not only did not decrease, but instead became more and more. Peter couldn't hold it any longer, and quickly asked, "Then what exactly are we going to do?" After the words fell, Dr. Octopus also raised his head with concern. And Richard was also full of patience at this moment, and continued to answer for the two. "Tomorrow, the two of you will find someone named Victor, who, like you, is also a member of the Dark Alliance. For some reason, he needs to capture the special power of the Fantastic Four, so all you have to do is to help him capture the Fantastic Four alive. This is the first battle since the establishment of my Dark Alliance, so I want the world to witness and remember my Dark Alliance. The entire Federation will be watching your fight, so do you know what to do?" After Richard finished speaking, Peter and Dr. Octopus had a huge wave in their hearts. They didn't expect Richard to make such a big battle, and they didn't expect that the two of them would be one of the protagonists of tomorrow's drama. For a while, the two of them couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Just the thought that billions of people will be following them tomorrow gave them both a burst of excitement and trepidation. Fame and fortune are the most magical products in the world. More than 6 billion people in the world are chasing these two words all the time. Even though Dr. Octopus and Peter have powerful powers, it doesn't mean that they won't be tempted by fame and fortune. After a lot of effort, the two finally calmed down the emotional fluctuations in their hearts, and now the two nodded heavily and assured. "Don't worry, Mr. Richard, we won't let you down." Peter licked the corner of his mouth and said excitedly, as did Dr. Octopus standing beside him. Looking at the state of the two, Richard was completely relieved. "Okay, I want to prepare. I will send you the information about Victor later, no later than tomorrow morning. You can go when you are ready." After giving a few words of encouragement, Richard waved his hand to send the two away, then turned around and came to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the scenery below, his eyes full of conquest. And just when Richard was making his final preparations on TV, the outside world caused a storm because of Richard, and it became more and more intense. The internet is full of discussions of tens of millions of netizens. What is the biggest air raid in history? What mysterious aliens have fallen from the sky and seized the TV station, etc. Under the speculation of many netizens, Richard had end titles on his head unknowingly. At the same time, the Fantastic Four, who was targeted by Richard, are also discussing Richard at the moment. In the Rambo building, Johnny looked at the three of Reed and said loudly, "Why don't we take action? These people actually forcibly occupied the TV station, and also took hostages. Now is the time when we need to show up and save them. Why don't you agree? The news on the internet is overwhelming, and the Fantastic Four will naturally not fail to receive news. But there was a disagreement within them on whether to take action, and the main parties of the disagreement were still Johnny and Reed. Seeing Johnny's irritable appearance, Reed explained helplessly, "Until the police station doesn't do anything, they're not considered criminals, okay?" Listening to this explanation, Johnny couldn't agree at all, and immediately turned up a photo on the internet. This is the photo when Richard put on the tiger mask and summoned the Shadow Corps. Look at these people. Is there anyone who looks like a good person? Seeing how they hide their heads and show their tails, there must be a mistake in killing them, and I didn't let them go. I have to say that although Johnny's actions were a little reckless, his judgment was undoubtedly accurate. But it was of no use, and Reed's prudence meant that he would not agree to Johnny's adventure. Even listening to Johnny's appearance theory, Reed's face couldn't help but show an anger. According to you, what are we? Freaks. One with longer hands than 1 foot, one with fire all over, one like a rock. Do you mean we're criminals too? Reed was speechless, Johnny was speechless, and finally sat down a little depressed. For a while, the ears of the three of Reed became quiet, and the Fantastic Four also broke up because of this incident. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more.